I'm only regretful of one thing, that we didn't put more work into coming up with a better acronym than CCII. It doesn't translate into anything, but we'll struggle on without a good acronym.
I try not to use that term. When people ask me what we're doing.
Well, it keeps it a mystery.
I mean,
I want to welcome the audience and our council members. And for the sake of the audience, I'll introduce myself. I'm Fred Heldenfels, Chairman of the Council for Continuous Improvement and Innovation in Texas Higher Education, and it's a pleasure to welcome everyone to our fourth meeting. I also want to thank my fellow council members again for each of your commitment to Texas Higher Education and your willingness to help serve our state. Want to recognize we have a guest with us this morning, the new chairman of the Texas Workforce Commission, Andre Alcantar. Andre, thanks for being with us, and congratulations on your appointment. Be careful, though. We may just call you up for a panel just, to test you. As everyone, I think, is aware, we are striving to establish the next long-range plan for higher education beyond closing the gaps by 2015. In preparation, we need to begin reaching consensus regarding the measurable long-range goals and objectives that we as a council recommend for assessing our progress beyond the current higher education plan and looking towards true global excellence. As you'll recall from our April meeting, I'd like for us to secure consensus on the metrics that we propose as a council by our October 24th meeting, so that the coordinating board can consider adopting these recommendations at its meeting the next day and informing legislators about these recommendations prior to the beginning of the 83rd Texas legislative session. In fact, the presentation of this council's recommendations will be the major policy discussion on the board agenda the next morning, and I will probably be asking perhaps 3 or 4 of the council members to volunteer themselves to be the panel for that discussion at the board meeting. So those of you who could be available the next morning, you might be thinking about that. During today's meeting, we're going to be considering some measures of success that are related to workforce. As you may recall, 2 of the 9 outcome measures recommended by FSG concern the workforce. 1, employer ratings of the preparation and quality of graduates from Texas public higher education institutions, and 2, measures of the alignment of post-secondary degrees, courses, and program content with workforce needs. With this in mind, and to provide some background information for council members, consideration of our recommendations, this morning's plan is to first hear from Dr. Anthony Carnival, research professor and director of the Georgetown University Center on Education and the Workforce, regarding a forecast of jobs and their education requirements. Then we'll hear from Doug Ridge, Director of Employer Initiatives at the Texas Workforce Commission, about the importance of engaging employers, business organizations, and the economic development community in the ongoing development of a customer-focused, market-driven workforce system. We'll also hear at that time from Mary Smith, Assistant Deputy Commissioner, about how employers' opinions on a number of general competencies relevant to the employment preparation of graduates from Texas institutions are incorporated into the faculty-led tuning process. And finally, Lee Holcomb, our director of the Higher Education Policy Institute, will provide a brief overview of post-secondary education costs and a preview of degree cost measures that will be considered by this council at the October meeting. After our presentations and discussions this morning, our council will be divided into 3 pre-assigned groups. We've kind of been shuffling those groups around as some of our members have not been able to join us here today. I think we will have 10 members. Pam Williford is planning to be here. So we'll have 2 groups of 3, 1 group of 4. We'll try to reach small group consensus on metric recommendations, and then we'll briefly discuss each group's recommendations as a full council. I'll be asking each of the groups to address the following questions, and this is on your agenda. 1, does your group recommend that we add either or both of the 2 measures of workforce success that were recommended by FSG? Employer ratings of preparation and quality of graduates, and or B, measure of alignment of post-secondary degrees, courses, and program content with workforce needs. And secondly, then, the second question, does your group recommend that Texas add a metric for workforce success? And if so, does your group recommend that we use an input employment driver as a metric? For example, alignment between certificate and degrees awarded and workforce needs. Or a throughput employment results metric, or what would be called a lagging metric, which would be employment and earnings, or both driver and results metrics. Overall, with metrics, if any, does your group recommend that our state use for purposes of measuring workforce measuring workforce success, and why? And then thirdly, with respect to Lee Holcomb's overview of post-secondary education cost and degree cost measures that will be considered by the Council in October, what feedback, if any, do you have for Dr. Holcomb as he proceeds with research on those metrics? Now, before we get started, Dr. Melinda Valdez-Ellis has a brief word for the Council. Melinda?
And I'm not sure we're able to get the slide up on the screen, but it is provided for you in the folder. If you open it up, the small group summary themes. Oh, I've got it. You'll see there we listed the benchmarking, the 60% benchmark, international benchmarking that is, competency levels, the 3 FSG measures of success, and following 8th graders to college. In regards to international benchmarking, Canada, Australia, Germany, and Korea were the recommended countries, and it was unanimously decided to examine states similar to Texas. 2 of the 3 groups agreed that 60% was indeed a reasonable benchmark for the year 2030. And as far as how to incorporate competency levels, the usefulness of the Program for International Student Assessment, competency definitions, and the need to modify how competency levels are measured nationally to gain relevance were all cited as important when discussing how to actually incorporate them. When discussing the 3 measures of success as prepared by the Foundation Strategy Group, the groups unanimously recognized that the value of existing integrated post-secondary education data system, IPEDS, information for the percent number or percent increase of students who complete their credential within 150% of program time across all states was, again, indeed useful. And finally, another unanimous recommendation was to add the following of the 8th graders in and through college as a metric as brought forth through NCHEMS. And in your folder, I believe it's right behind your agenda in the bios, the full 4-page summary is listed there for you for your review, including the themes in a little bit more detail. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Melinda. Does anybody have any comments? It's great that we've got 5 bullet points upon which we think we've reached consensus. The only thing I would say is that what I recall about the benchmarking is that in addition to the countries, we were talking about not just peer states, but identifying 3 to 5 of the best performing or aspirational, so to speak, states, I think was the intent, albeit states pertinent to Texas. If not, if there's no questions or comments on that, we will move to our panel. The first panel on projections of jobs and education requirements through 2018. And so I will introduce Dr. Anthony Carnival from Georgetown University, who will be joining us from Washington, D.C. Dr. Carnival, welcome.
Hi, how are you?
Can you hear us okay?
I can hear you loud and clear.
All righty. Can everyone hear Dr. Carnival? All right. There's a detailed biography for Dr. Carnival in your handout materials on the left side of your notebooks. But in brief, Dr. Carnival is an internationally recognized authority on education, training, and employment, and he currently serves as the director and research professor of the Georgetown University Center on Education and Workforce. He has served appointments under 3 U.S. presidents. And Dr. Carnival, with your permission, I'll skip over the rest of your bio, although I do think it's notable that He was appointed by President Bush to serve on the White House Commission on Technology and Adult Education. And with that, sir, we will turn it over to you for your presentation.
Thank you. Can you hear me clearly? I can see you nodding your head, so I'll proceed. Whenever I talk to educators, I like to begin with an apology. I'm an economist, and that disability can be troublesome. So let me say to begin with that, especially sitting here at Georgetown, I don't, or by most sensible people, believe that the only purpose of education is to make people employable. Education serves lots of different functions in our society and in our political system. Makes us good citizens, good neighbors. And education serves purposes that are unto itself. It is, knowledge has its own value, its own innate value that in many respects relates to nothing else but knowledge per se. People like to learn, and learning is of value in and of itself. Having said that, though, we're sitting here in the United States, a democratic capitalist system, in which the one real qualification for citizenship is that you get a job. We won't make you vote, but we will expect you to get a job unless you've got an awfully good reason not to. So the reason I begin with that perspective is that historically, roughly in recent times, since about 1983, the key variable in deciding whether or not you'll get a job with a living wage, with the wage that will allow you to form a family and participate fully in your time, the key variable, the key requirement is some kind of post-secondary education training. That is relatively new in economic history. 20 to 30 years is not a long time in the history of economies. But it is more and more certain. We pretty well know now that about 60% of the jobs require some kind of post-secondary education and training, and a lot of those other 40% of jobs are either jobs that people don't want or they're jobs that people use to climb the economic ladder, oftentimes while they're still in school. So career jobs in America are jobs that require some kind of post-secondary education and training. There are still jobs for young men with high school degrees in places like Texas. If you have a strong natural resource base, if you have a strong agriculture, any other kind of economy that draws its resources from the earth, and when construction is high, which it was in the 90s in the United States before the bubble burst, there are good jobs for men with high school degrees, but only about 15% of them. And good jobs with high school degrees are almost exclusively for men. There really aren't many decent jobs for women with high school degrees. Women don't get any real traction in the labor market until they hit the AA. Certificates don't work well for women. If they do, it's only in the sense that many of the women who get certificates earn more money and are more employable because they can get a job, even if the job doesn't pay well. And they're more likely to get a job and make more money and have more hours of work, have more consistent employment with certificates compared to women with the same high school test that they have. And that is compared to people in the bottom half of the high school class, they do all right. But all right means anywhere from $14,000 to $22,000 a year. So back to my original point, I think the way to make it most plainly is to go back in time quickly. If we go back to 1973, which was the last year of the American post-war boom, post-World War II boom, when we dominated the global economy. If we go back to 73, what we'll see is that 70% of Americans who were working and in the labor force had high school or were high school dropouts. What is remarkable about that time is that more than half of them, about 60%, were in the middle class. If what we mean by the middle class, there is no official definition. If what we mean by the middle class is anybody who is earning wages somewhere above the bottom 30% and below the top 30%, that middle 40%. In current earnings, that would be about $35,000 to $85,000 a year. When we look fast forward to the present time, that number, 60% of high school or less who are in the middle class, drops down to below 40%. And that includes a lot of people who are still working, who learned a lot of their skills on the job in occupations that they couldn't get into now if they were starting all over again, because they require at least some post-secondary certification or degree in order to get the entry-level job. They learned it on the job, but that's not the way it's done anymore. So we have a system in which essentially where one ends up in the middle class, whether you're in the middle class, where you end up in it, depends largely on post-secondary education. The other change that is remarkable is that the degrees themselves seem to matter less and less. That is, it's still true that if you get a professional degree, you'll make more than a PhD, who will make more than somebody with a BA, who will make more than somebody with an AA, who will make more than somebody with a certificate. But the variation within degree level is now much greater than the variation among degrees. Now, what that means is, if you're a male, most of the high-paying certificate jobs go to males. If you're a male and you get a certificate in engineering or drafting, HVAC, heating, ventilation, air conditioning, computers, you'll make more than the average AA. You'll make more than about 20% of all BAs, principally female BAs. But if you get an AA, there are 20% of AAs make more than the average BA. 40% of bachelor's degrees make more than the average person with a graduate degree. There is a huge difference in earnings that is more and more driven by not your degree level, but by what you take. If you get the right major, if you're in the right program of instruction, it matters more than degree level in many, many cases, and that is increasingly true. It was not true in the 1970s and the 1980s. It is true now. Hence the huge increase in attention to community colleges, industry-based certifications, for-profit schools that offer job-related learning and awards and certificates and degrees. So we have a system in which essentially what happened in the United States, and it really began with a vengeance after the 1980-81 recession. Numbers started to change in 1983. In the 1970s, the value of college actually dropped in the United States. Beginning in 83, it began to go up very rapidly. No one understood why at the time. It's gone up ever since. It increased till about 2002. And then BA wages flattened out and fell a little bit. But the difference between the BA wage or the college wage and the high school wage has actually increased, even though the BA wage, the college wage has come down a little bit, which is what that tells you is that the high school degree lost more and more value. So that we're in a world where post-secondary education and training is really a must for more and more of us. And where, unlike other systems in the world, our workforce development system is our post-secondary education system. We have no other institutions, although we're growing them, from the for-profit schools to the industry certifications. and other interventions where people make very focused kinds of education and training available. The projections for jobs in this case are really quite strong, in spite of the fact that we've had a god-awful and are still having a god-awful recession and recovery. When you look at the job performance throughout the recession, what you see is a continuation of the structural change in the economy that began to accelerate in 1983, in which the jobs that require high school or less, they go away and they're not coming back. What we see is that in the recovery, virtually all of the job growth accrues to people with some post-secondary education and training. So when we come out the other side of this thing, we're going to have a much more post-secondary intensive economy than we had when we went into it. So one of the things about recessions now is their destructive power is principally focused on high school educated and dropout workers in the longer haul. So that we know now that ultimately most of us require some post-secondary education and training for work. That means, and I think that all of you are well aware of this, you're talking about it today, that employability has become one of the standards that people want to apply to post-secondary programs. The state of the art in doing that is the use of wage records and transcript data. The United States has been producing, American employers have been giving their wage records to the government since about 1937. Roughly 15 years ago, because none of us could figure out what the dropout rate was because kids moved around too much in high school and grade school, we began to put transcripts online. We're almost done with that. We dropped another $500 million in it, into that activity in the Obama stimulus package. We now have about 29 states or 30 states, the count goes up all the time, who have connected wage records and transcript data. That really is the gold standard in determining the economic value of post-secondary programs. Not that there isn't other kinds of value, but if you want to know the economic value, what you want to know is, did people in this particular program, did they get a job? Did they keep a job? Did they earn wages in that job that justified the cost of their education? And another piece of information which is useful, but not always determinative, are they working in the field? If you're working in the field and you come out of an occupational program of any kind, you're going to earn a lot more money than somebody who doesn't. And essentially, the higher education system has become a workforce learning system. Presently, only about 10% of bachelor's degrees are in liberal arts and humanities. The rest are essentially occupational. 25% business, another 15% or so in STEM, another 10% in teaching, and so on. You run down even bachelor's degrees, you see that they are more and more occupational. And graduate degrees are almost by definition occupational because they're specialized. In community colleges, about half the degrees, a little more than half, are general AAs whose purpose is to move you on four-year degrees, but a little less than half are occupational. So more and more governments and the citizenry want to know before their children go what particular majors or educational strategies will do for them in the labor market, given the rising costs of education, the higher and higher debt loads in education. It is truly now an economic investment. It's probably the first real economic investment young people make in their lives. The first time they work, use their earnings for investment purposes generally, so that there is an ongoing pressure, I think, that is not going to go away to measure fairly direct the value of different programs of study in labor markets. Note that in the national dialogue, when we began to hemorrhage higher education spending and default rates rose, everybody went after the for-profit colleges. Ultimately, when the measurement was decided to regulate the for-profit colleges, nobody asked to measure learning. Nobody asked to get employer opinions about how good their graduates were, because they were already doing that. Troubling thing with that is response rates on those surveys rarely go above 10% by public institutions or for-profit institutions. They're not valid. So in the end, what the government reached for was wage records tied to transcript data. The for-profits send their transcripts into the government. The government then sends the transcripts over to the Social Security Administration, who gets the wages of the individuals from different programs, reports the wages, and in this case, because default rates are a primary concern, runs the wages against default rates. That is, asks, do you have enough discretionary income after you get this degree or certificate to allow you to pay back your loans? But ultimately, what we have there is a wage standard post-secondary programs. I think it will increasingly become the case that we'll use that standard in the rest of the higher ed system, first in two-year colleges, and perhaps ultimately down the road in four-year institutions as well, given the fact that, as in healthcare, we need universal coverage here for people at post-secondary, and we simply can't afford it without building some outcome standards and driving institutions to those standards. They needn't just be about wages. And of course, I suspect they won't be. They will be about, in the case of educators, there'll be a strong push to make them about learning as well, and about student satisfaction as well. And of course, private spending will always be able to buy whatever it likes in the education market. That's why there'll probably always be a Georgetown. So I think that in the end, this is really the early years in the development of a governance system that will rely more and more on economic indicators to help students and institutions make better decisions.
Sorry, I didn't have my mic on. One of the questions, Dr. Carnival, that we're struggling with here in Texas, the good news is that we do include certificates in our measurement of post-secondary success, in our measurement of the number of attainments. As we see that today's need in Texas is 59%, according to, I think, your study on workforce in the South, and that's going to continue to grow. You know, as you point out, the southern states as a group trail the rest of the nation by about a decade, but the trend, the pattern is the same. As we set targets for attainment, can you help us disaggregate in terms of the percentages of the pie, how many will need to be BAs, how many graduate degrees, how many AA degrees, and how many certificates?
In the end, let me do these numbers using the onboard computer here, which is my head. In the end, the number we come up with is nationally is roughly 60%. When we look at current data on education requirements, and when we look forward out to 2020, which we're in the process of doing, we get another, I think it's 3 or 4%, so it becomes 64, 65%. When you break that down by degree level, what you get is about 30% BA. You get, I think it's about 7 or 8, or maybe it's 10% graduate and professional. You get roughly equivalence between AAs required on the job, or where they produce good wages on the job, and certificates. Certificates are really the new kid on the block, and they are now the second largest award given in post-secondary education. And many of them, not all, about 70% of them really do have value, but a fair number of them don't. It's a tough question about whether or not, given scarce resources, how you choose among them. Some of them, and the choices are not easy. If somebody's getting trained to be if someone's getting trained to be a nurse's aide, getting a certificate, you'll find that their wages are very low. But as I said before, their wages compared to people with the same test scores, that is from usually the bottom half of the high school class, their wages are relatively high. They're not good wages. And their likelihood of employment and sustained employment is much higher. So it's not a simple standard. There's a tendency for people to say, well, everybody should make more than a high school graduate if they make a certificate. But that's not true of people from the bottom half of the high school class. And secondly, there are many cases where people get certificates for purely educational reasons. And I think most Americans, at least I would agree, that if you go to the Northern Virginia Community College, which is right across the river here in D.C., and you get a certificate in liberal studies, I think that's fine. As long as it connects you to an AA and the AA connects you to a BA. I think if you can go to Georgetown and get a degree in the classics, you can go to Northern Virginia Community College and get a degree in a certificate in liberal studies. These are not easy questions. When you start, the moment education became human capital, we set up difficult problem for ourselves about how we're going to value it and how we're going to deploy it. And there is a tendency in any economic system for the economic value to take over.
So, keeping the wage earning potential in mind, then, as you described it, and extending your study 2 years to 2020, nationally, you see the need to target as much as 64% with post-secondary attainment. A little less than half of that would be BAs. 7 to as much as 10% graduate and professional. So, by my math, that leaves at least, if the AA and the certificate pools are roughly equivalent, about at least 12%, perhaps a little bit more, for each of those categories. Is that an accurate restatement?
That's roughly correct. Keep in mind that as we do this, think of a person who, this person doesn't exist, but they're emblematic. You might have a PhD, you might have a professional degree, a PhD, a BA, you might have an AA. Let's say you started out as an AA nurse and you ended up a doctor, and along the way you got a doctorate in nursing. So there is a case, given the transitivity of the system, that is the ability to move in it, which is what's attractive about certain parts of it, that you could have one person could have many of these. A substantial share of certificates go to BAs and graduate degrees, for instance. So the numbers don't always add to 100. So if the way you just did it is about like I did, but in the end, you're going to have more degrees than you're going to have people. That's the other way to look at it.
Sure, yeah. Makes perfect sense. I guess we kind of tend to think of it as in terms of that's the percentage of people with that degree as a terminal degree, so to speak. But obviously the workforce is very dynamic, and we're seeing the trend more and more of people starting, as you said, at one level and then going back perhaps later after some work experience to further their education. So,
and that pattern is particularly strong in the highest paying occupations. So I think it's a trend that is, as earnings and education levels go up together in the economy, which they've been doing at an increasing rate since 1983, we'll see more and more of that, more and more multiple degree and certificate holders. And we left out one award, and that is the industry-based certification, which we believe, although this is a weaker empirical conclusion because the data is not good, we believe that industry-based certification roughly A's or certificates in terms of the number of those that bring strong earnings returns.
So I think it broke up a little bit on the VOIP, but I think you said roughly equivalent to the AAs and community and institutional certificates. Our
estimate, which comes from, we look at real-time hiring in the economy, and we see something on the order of 13% of hires have industry-based certifications. I'm guessing that when you, if we could get the data, we find out that 6 or 7% of them have industry-based certifications only, and that the rest have other things as well.
Okay, so that 6 or 7% then would be additive to your projected 63 to 64%.
Yes, I would. We've never done that because we'd get beaten up by other economists, but in my head, I do that. Yes. Okay,
that's helpful. That's very helpful. Members, questions that from Jerry? Oh, Ray.
I had a question. On your curve on page 3 of your report that we've got here about a decade behind, I note that between the 2010s and the 2020s, you actually are projecting an increase in the gap between the national post-secondary demand and the southern post-secondary demand. Do we have any understanding of why that might be?
We think we know. When we track back through the numbers, we find that there is a fall off. We use our growth model is industry based, so we get occupations from industry and then get education from occupations. And when we look at the industry growth, we see that the South is invested in manufacturing, for instance, in a lot of old line manufacturing, with the exception of North Carolina, where a very substantial share is auto-connected, which is really modern manufacturing. So what we find is that some of the industry, but old line manufacturing has engineers, just like new manufacturing does. But so we find a decline in employment in educated people just because the industry goes down. And then what those people don't get absorbed elsewhere because the growth elsewhere requires different occupational characteristics for post-secondary people. So the South actually increased at an increasing rate for quite a while. But then now the industry base is beginning to cause problems. That is, the industry base is not being upskilled as rapidly as the workforces in industry bases in other states. The overall volume of jobs in the South is just fine. The increase in the number of jobs, see, and others who run estimates of in recovery, job growth, the South is actually creates more jobs relatively than a lot of the rest of the country. But there's a quality issue.
Charles?
Dr. Wheat, we understand that our goal is in the STEM areas and the college level and the technical degrees and the junior. Can you hear me? I'm sorry. how do we put in place policies that, I mean, we're coming up short in the number of kids that are graduating from STEM and the number of kids that are graduating on the technical degrees. How do we put in place policies that make sure we hit state goals of what those numbers need to be for the state to have the kind of economy we'd like to have it over the next 10 or 15 years? How do we drive kids into those programs and make them successful?
Well, I'm an economist, and like most people who have some sort of expert base, every time I see I got a hammer, and every time I see a nail, every problem I see looks like a nail to me. So my bias about this is that we need stronger connections between labor markets and post-secondary systems and secondary systems. They're huge. The real failure in America is still in the secondary institutions, and we're moving towards a national curriculum that's fine, or curriculums in every state that are substantially upgraded in high schools. All that is fine, except we're giving kids only one way to get from high school to post-secondary institutions, and that way it's a very academic track. And that is I think, the data tells us that comes with failure. That is, the more you want Algebra 2 in high schools, the more dropouts you're going to get and the less transition to post-secondary. Kids simply don't learn that way, or you can't keep them in school that way. But in any event, I think the answer is, when we look at all the data, and we look at data on learning, because we do some of that, and people who do it a lot better than we do, the conclusion we all seem to come to is that young people need to have some intention about what they're doing. If they intend to go and graduate and follow a particular career, they're much more likely to do it than if they don't know where they're going. That is a strong conclusion that's coming up in all the research. Essentially, it's sort of folk wisdom in the end with data, which is, if you know where you're going, you're more likely to get there. So my bias is, if we ask them why they continue, most of them, especially those who are not from the upper middle class, say because they want to get a decent job. So I think tending to that intention early on, I think in high school, but certainly in college, so they can see light at the end of the tunnel, so they know where they're going. We know that increases participation in graduation rates, and it does move to the higher wage majors. In this case, the only higher wage majors, the only majors with higher wages than STEM are the healthcare professions and some business majors.
Can I just follow up on that?
Sure.
Do you think that incentives would play a role in increasing those numbers? I'm talking about financial incentives.
At the margin, yes.
Scholarships, grants, those kinds of things. Maybe focus more on those kinds of degrees in an effort to try to get the outcome you want.
I think that there's actually a change of view in this in the research, which is the effect of increasing student aid to move people through school was substantial up through the early 1990s, but not any larger. That is, the incentive effects of giving kids more money were no more substantial than doing lots of other things. For instance, giving them clear intentions, trying to help them through counseling to figure out where to go and why they're going. That really, in the end, is the more powerful tool. But since the middle of the 90s, the crunch in higher education spending, the increased cost of higher education, and the declining discretionary income is actually more important than increasing costs. The declining discretionary income in American families below the median level has made cost even more important now. So it's I think it's a 50-50 proposition. It's half cost and half counseling. there's a very substantial literature on this. I read it that way. Some people will argue it's more counseling than cost, that the cost issue is overestimated in terms of its power, or the need for scholarship is overestimated. Other people argue that it's underestimated. Things like more and more students are working when they go to college. If they work more than 15 hours a week, they begin immediately to decrease the likelihood that they'll ever graduate. And the vast majority of them, or the majority of them that aren't in elite colleges, are working more than 15 hours a week. So, and that's a cost issue. How we would deal with that, I don't know. We can't. Looking at the data, it seems to me it'd be awfully hard to afford to replace those earnings that they get from the labor market to leverage their education. The most successful kids doing that, by the way, are kids who get certificates that make them employable early on in their college career, and then they use that income to continue in computers, for instance. That is a common finding in nursing. That's a
I'll do one more follow-up. What we do in Texas from the state funding level is we incentivize colleges to teach science courses, engineering courses, and we give them a higher level of funding than we do for the humanities. And I'm beginning to wonder maybe whether or not we're incentivizing the wrong people, that maybe we should be incentivizing kids, and that's kind of where I'm going with all of this thought process, is that in a time when tuition is just gone through the roof and wages have stayed flat, that we're going to lose a lot of really bright kids that have the capability of going into these programs that we definitely have to have as a country, unless we rethink the way we fund their education. And I don't have that totally thought through, but that's where I'm struggling.
STEM is one of those areas, like healthcare, like education. Truthfully, that is, if you don't get a graduate degree in education, it's unlikely that you can sustain yourself as a teacher. You don't get anywhere near the earnings return graduate degree that you would get from a chemistry graduate degree. But it's still necessary. So if you're going to be a school teacher or a STEM worker, you have to plan on going to graduate school, unless you're going to be an engineer. You can do pretty well. Engineering is still pretty much a BA occupation, although graduate degrees in engineering do increase earnings a fair amount. They're just not as obligatory as they are in other STEM disciplines like the sciences. So I think you're right. I think that my bias would be not ever having run an education institution, but being an American, which makes me an expert on education. My bias would be that you probably should do both. That is, incentivize the youth and incentivize the institutions as well, I think. And then one of the major questions here always is looking backward after you do these things. Did kids or did the institutions do more than would have happened if you hadn't given them money? But I believe firmly that programs that are more expensive should be allocated more aid per student, and I believe that all the way down through the community colleges as well. It's one of the articulation problems between the labor market and our higher ed system is our aid system tends to treat every education as if it is equally costly. And there are big, as you know, there are big cost differentials by major and program of study.
Members, anyone else have questions for Dr. Carnevale? Woody?
Dr. Carnevale, given the demographics of Texas, which essentially in terms of post-secondary education, if you took all of our ethnic and racial groups and we were outperforming the country in all of them, but when you rolled them up, the answer is we actually underperform the country in terms of post-secondary attainment. given the weighting of our groups. In other words, that we're overweighted in lower performing in terms of higher education attainment groups. If you look at our most recent pipeline data, if you look at the Hispanic population, post-secondary attainment is at about 40% of the Anglo population. And yet, if you look at the demographics from birth to 24, all of the growth in the state is Hispanic. So my question from a policy intervention standpoint or recommendation would be, our demographics, our future, I mean, are we essentially trapped by our demographics, another version of your southern strategy, so to speak, or are there some policy interventions that can lead us in a direction to being more competitive in our workforce? Because right now our trends would be negative as far as being able to be competitive. Even if we outperform in every group, the national averages, we will underperform the nation.
The numbers I know say that Texas and California actually do pretty well here. But there is a problem. That is, neither state is keeping up. That is a problem, and generally with African Americans and Hispanics across the South and across the country, look more closely by race and ethnicity. But clearly, the population pressures are stronger in the South, stronger in Texas and California and New Mexico and so on. So in a way, those states are being asked to do extra work for the rest of the country because Hispanics and African Americans are going to be a larger and larger share of our workforce. They're not randomly distributed throughout the United States. So essentially, we're asking Texas to do a job for us, and the rest of us aren't going to pay for it. So I think that is some way wrong and probably not very efficient. How you fix that, the obvious way, is you make a sincere effort, and I think the rest of us should chip in to tackle the problems that come with being coming from a language minority, coming from second and third generation immigration populations where we know there are educational problems, not just cognitive, but problems in terms of their acculturation. So that the United States is never, we don't do this. One of the, there are certain things you almost have to accept about America, and that is that unless we can turn this problem into an education problem, and I think the key with Hispanics and African Americans goes beyond cognitive issues, although those are real. That is, they need to have more access to cognitive learning, but there's other kinds of learning that are required as well. So that my bias about this is that the country is depending on 10 or 12 states to educate the country's workforce. That's going to arrive over the next 30 or 40 years, and we're all dependent on you to do it. I don't see, but I do, I think that's unrealistic and not fair.
Dr. Carnevale, one of the things that we have later in our agenda to consider are two workforce success measures that a group we worked with helped develop when we started a couple of years ago on trying to envision where Texas needs to be by 2030. So I'm going to read off the two metrics and ask you to comment on the type of metric they're recommending, as well as what specific numbers would best serve, or whether you feel there would be a better choice. The two metrics recommended were employer ratings, that is, ratings of preparation and quality of graduates from Texas institutions, and or the measurement of alignment of post-secondary degrees and curriculum with workforce needs. What's your opinion of those as proposed metrics, and is there something that you would recommend in lieu of or in addition to these?
I think it's good to get employer metrics into the conversation, that is, employer opinions. I don't think it's a very scientific way to go about it. We do need employer involvement, and any employer involvement get is a good thing. We know that. There's not much doubt about it. But my argument would be that in the end, you got to use wage records and transcript data. If that's what you mean by measuring alignment, then I would agree with the metric. I think there's a tendency to shy away from wage records and transcript data and related data because, one, it's hard to do. You've got to get labor departments and education departments to work together. But in the case of Texas, you have some of the finest, that is, to the extent people have connected the dots between wages and transcripts, it's been done well in Texas. So it's sitting there, as far as I know. But I would also argue that the wage records, the employability data, that is the voice of the employer. The extent to which employers hire and pay people is really what speaks for them and tells you what they want. You're not going to find out. You'll find out if they're hiring technicians over at the hospital, radiology technicians. But with the wage records and transcript data, you don't get to talk to somebody that says, well, what are the 12 things radiology technicians need to know now that they didn't need to know 5 years ago? That you can't get anywhere else but from the employer. So their value, I think, is putting clothes on the horse. I mean, giving texture to what the data says, helping you figure out what it really means, what you're looking at in the data. But I would go in with the data in my hand.
So in setting an employability standard, specifically, what with the wage records and transcript data would you measure? What would the actual number or ratio or percentage target be?
I would do the simple things first, which is to say I would simply want to know, looking backward, because that's what you're doing, is that is up to this point. You can get very current with this data without every quarter. You wouldn't want to use it every quarter. But every year, you could say last year up until now, we know that people in this nursing program got hired. We've been producing about, let's say it's a community college or a nursing school, 55 a year. They've all become employed. We know how many quarters, that is how many 3-month periods or weeks they've been working. We know how much they've been able to hold down a job, and we know what their wages are. And then the thing you'd ask, which I would say I wouldn't even try for it at first, is are they working in field? The data doesn't necessarily make that easy to figure out, although you can sort of figure it out, because there is industry in the data. But industry and occupation aren't the same thing. So you'll find that there are a lot of nurses who work at Walmart. And that'll throw you. If you go look, you'll see you go talk to Walmart and you find out they're working as nurses. So pass out the aisles, apparently. So, there is I think the wage records, and they have problems all over the place, but I think that they are really sort of the earnest money in the game. Don't want to overuse them, and you need to be careful what you compare the wage to. My bias is that you shouldn't say everybody should make as much as the average college graduate or high school graduate. I think you need to do it relative to the people who are getting the degrees, but that's a level of sophistication. Because if you don't, you'll end up saying that nurses' aides programs should be abolished, and they shouldn't be, in my judgment. They do make people better off. That should be the standard, I think, ultimately. For any program that looks like it's not performing, I'd ask that first. Are they getting people jobs more than people with these kinds of education qualifications would normally get, and are they earning more than these kinds of qualifications would normally earn? I'd just be careful at the bottom end of the earning scale with all this stuff.
That's well put. I'm reminded just yesterday, dropping my vehicle off at the auto body repair shop, the young lady who was helping me had just earned her psychology and sociology degree, but she's working in an auto repair shop. in customer service, but one could argue she's using her degree dealing with frustrated, angry customers. So that is a little more. There's a little more subtlety to how you determine are they working in field than necessarily meets the eye.
Well, you hit on something that's very important for educators to be cognizant of, and that is, in the United States, people work out of field a lot. Ultimately, although less and less so, but people work out of field a lot. And so what you really want to know is, how are they doing? For me, that's the wage. And first of all, are they employed? Are they employable? And secondly, is what's the wage? Because you'll find a lot of liberal arts students who do just fine. They don't do as well as engineers, but they do fine. They make, on average in America, about over a 45-year career, they make about $43,000 a year.
Okay, that makes it makes good sense to really try to focus first on the how are they doing measurement. Members, any further questions or comments for Dr. Carnival? Harold.
Yes, sir. You had mentioned earlier that about 60% of the workforce was requires some post-secondary education, and you also mentioned that the jobs for the high school and less degree are gone and they're not coming back. Could you expand on that a little bit and kind of where we're going to address that as a country?
There is the easy way to say this is by talking about manufacturing, utilities, and transportation. In 1979, all three of those peaked just before the 80-81 recession. They all tanked the 80-81 recession, while previous to that recession, in every recession, in those industries, almost 40% of the people who lost their jobs used to go back to the same job, or at least the same industry, the same occupation. Beginning in 80-81, that began to fall off very rapidly. It came to the point where in the last three recessions, what's been notable about them are jobless recoveries, slow recoveries. All jobless recovery means is that the jobs are growing slower than GDP. That is, we're making more money than we're creating jobs. But what causes that is structural change. That is technology, mostly computer technology in the last 30 years. Basically automates anything that is repetitive, any task that's repetitive in a job. During a recession, technology really moves into the labor force in force. So it begins because people are in trouble and trying to save money. Automation accelerates. It used to be that automation accelerated the economy. Now it accelerates even more in recessions, so that those industries, manufacturing, utilities, transportation, have consistently gone down since '79. There's some evidence that they've plateaued, that they're not going to go any further down. Some hopeful evidence. So, and what replaced them, and remember, a lot of those jobs were for high school workers or even dropouts who make very good wages, especially men, women as well. And what's replaced them are jobs in healthcare, information technology, in a variety of service industries that require more education. So one way to look at this is we've got an economy where the jobs in the middle that paid well and only required a little education are going fairly fast. And the jobs in the middle now, many of them don't pay as well as those jobs used to. If you work in a union shop for Chrysler, you could make $85,000 a year. A lot of the healthcare jobs require you to get education beyond high school, and they don't pay $85,000 a year. So one way to look at it is that those jobs have been displaced by jobs that require post-secondary education but don't have the wage performance. That ends up being a question about whether or not you can recapture the past. I think in the end you can't. Those are the jobs we have. So what's beginning to be fairly apparent is that that trend seems to just continue. There is recent research that shows, that argues that we've bottomed out, that we've eliminated so many high school and dropout jobs in the economy, that there aren't many more to take. So that, for instance, if you're somebody who cuts hair for a living, we can't replace you with a machine because we haven't figured out how to do that yet. So there are a lot of jobs that are relatively low wage, relatively low skill, that don't get automated and probably won't get automated. So a lot of people think that we're stabilizing it. Destruction of jobs that require high school or less may have bottomed out.
Do you look at the supply and demand effect, though, on some of these positions as those employees don't return to the industry? I'll use construction and one particular job as an illustration. Since the peak 5 years or so ago in the construction industry, at which time there were over 7.7 million employees in that industry, 2.2 million have left that industry. Today, just slightly over 5.5 million are employed, and yet the unemployment rate for construction has declined from 24% to now, quote unquote, only 14%. What that means is those 2.2 million people have gone to other industries, stopped looking for work, they're gone. The anomaly is one position, commercial truck drivers, is in great shortage. And today in Texas, and I suspect this is the same in North Dakota and other energy booming states, in the Eagle Ford Shale or out in Midland, truck drivers with a commercial license are being paid $80,000 to $100,000 a year in wages to drive those trucks, which is creating a ripple through problem with those of us who don't pay our truck drivers that much. So, that's an illustration of how demand. What's the effect that you see demand having on restoring some of those jobs because of the pressure on wages?
The labor market works precisely the way you're talking about. One of the interesting things with manufacturing, utilities, construction, etc., is that even when overall demand collapses, which it's been doing in manufacturing since '79, there's still shortages, spot shortages, they're called. There's particular occupations. You can't find people. The other thing is that just because an industry is declining doesn't mean there aren't jobs there, because in almost every industry, it varies all over the place, but one rule of thumb is that for every new job an industry creates, it creates 3 other job openings due to retirement, and that is the number that we're using now as baby boom retirement begins. It's different. I mean, in the case of a cashier's job, you get, every job for a cashier there, it turns over 10 times in 5 years. A medical doctor's job doesn't turn over in 5 years. So, but there is the baby boom retirement means that there are job openings in places where the occupation isn't growing. The other thing about construction, which is a little troublesome, is that the financial boom, the bubble, created an artificial demand there. That is, we were spending money we didn't have. It allowed males, especially in construction, to high school educated males to get good jobs without going to college. And it looks like in the short term, that is the next 4 or 5 years, those jobs aren't coming back all the way. And there's even an argument around that says that they'll never come back in the 90s. So what's happened here is that sector still supports men who have high school degrees or drop out of high school. To a certain extent, I'm not going to get rich there, but it's a job. It's not a bad job. So that, and it is what accounts when you look at the data, it's what accounts for the fact that women more and more use education as a strategy for mobility. And men have lagged behind on that, so that the economy in some ways is becoming more female because it's more service-oriented. Those jobs are accessible to them. So, but what's happened in this recession that people see as hopeful to see if it keeps up is after taking the biggest hit front end of the recession, economists in an attempted bit, which is always lame for economists, called it a man session. They understood what they meant. So but in the recovery, we're seeing that males going to college more, that their participation rate in college looks like it's ticking up a little bit. And a lot of people are saying that this recession may have been a wake-up call for men.
That's an interesting observation. Any final questions for Dr. Carnival? Dr. Carnival, we appreciate your participation and sharing your research with us. It's very helpful to trying to set our objectives for Texas workforce. And I assume when you mentioned there's 12 states the nation is relying on to train our workforce, Texas is included in one of those 12.
It's number 2.
So I guess we'd better take that responsibility pretty
I
darn seriously.
wish you all luck. I want to have a very opulent retirement. So,
thank you, sir. Thank you for joining us.
See you later. Thank you.
We'll move to our next panel, slightly early, regarding alignment of higher education in the workforce. And Doug Ridge has joined us with, he is Director of Employer Initiatives at Texas Workforce Commission. And Mary Smith is the Assistant Deputy Commissioner of Academic Planning and Policy here at the Coordinating Board. And it looks like the Commissioner and our Deputy Commissioner David Gardner just stepped out, but did you just need a seat, or are you there to help Doug and Mary in case they get in trouble?
This is where they position you seats.
Well, feel free to chime in any time, Commissioner. Yeah, Woody, go ahead.
Just to follow on Dr. Carnavelli, which I've had the privilege to listen to several times, to me it's very encouraging discussion because we've got this committee, the coordinating board, focused on the workforce and not just on institutions. So I would highly recommend an ability to continue to have a dialogue with Dr. Carnavelli, who is well recognized, as Raymond knows, the #1 expert in this area. And perhaps over time, even the coordinating board itself needs to expand its human talent to essentially stay as connected as he is with the workforce. Because to me, that's where the future lies, is being able to better connect our workforce needs with our higher education supply chain and to recognize all the little pieces that make it more productive. So I'm very encouraged by the direction of this debate.
Well, and for that reason, that's why I'm also glad that Doug was here for most of that discussion, and Andre, the Workforce Commission's new chairman, was able to listen in on that. So with that, I'll turn it over, Mary, to you and Doug for this next panel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Doug Ridge with Workforce Commission. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. I also appreciate our commissioner and as well as Commissioner Paredes being able to sit in here. You talked about alignment and employer ratings, and I think that this presentation will help you address not just the definition but the weighting of those. I want to talk less about what's going on today and more about what we're seeing in this system of economic development in the state and different strategies that all the players hopefully are going to be considering. A little background. We're running at about 7% unemployment, have been there since roughly February. We've stayed a point and a half, 2 points under the national average. At the same time, in 2011, we had over 500,000 people move into Texas. So when you start balancing those two things, it really makes it interesting. The increase or the influx of Fortune 100, Fortune 500, Fortune 1000 companies coming here has really created a lot of churn in the workforce. As we'll see in a few minutes, in the workforce databases that we keep through the Workforce Commission, which are heavily weighted towards people who are on unemployment compensation, looking for new jobs. At any given time, we have around 600,000 individuals in there. The turnover, and that's about 4 times a year, a little over. So that's roughly 2.4 million people who are getting employed, getting into the system. The opportunities for business right now that are being driven, we talked earlier, and every meeting I go to now, we talk about the Eagle Ford Shale. We talk about the Haynesville Barnett. We also talk about the Permian Basin and $90 a barrel oil. My background is the oil and gas business before I came here. The opportunities that are presented by $90 barrel oil, we know. We've done this before. The interesting thing is if you look at the investments that are going on right now, you're talking about $16 billion in upstream, midstream opportunities there for a multiplicity of jobs. It's not just roughnecks, it's welders, it's pipeliners, it's process technicians. And then the other piece that's really exciting is the amount of natural gas that's available for either fuel or an input into another process is giving Texas a global competitive advantage in fertilizers, in petrochemicals of all kinds. There are about, $10 billion of projects signed. We are working with various groups around the state and over $40 billion worth of opportunities that we're trying to attract to the state. Makes it interesting when you talk about the people who are going to run these things, the people who are going to build them, the infrastructure, the maintenance. It's not that we don't have the people, but the scale is going to change, and we're going to have to be able to develop a collaborative model which brings in alignment and built to the requirements of employers, which brings in the employer rating, so that we can meet this need. Yes, sir. We are talking about over 100 years. And the interesting part of it, and this is something that Dr. Carnival was talking about on technology. One of the things that we found in a prior life was we discovered horizontal drilling. We discovered horizontal drilling in a time of very low prices so that we could accelerate production. And just as he was saying, the decrease runs a change in technology the same as an increase in the output price. So the changes in technology are affecting the skills requirements for people from the rig site all the way through to the gas station. It's a completely different game here. And it's not just for welders and roughnecks, it's for civil engineers, mechanical engineers, geologists. If you've been a geologist for 20 years, you probably never received education in the production parameters around shale. And so now we're having to address those kinds of training, competency-based training programs at multiple levels. This one, Dr. Carnival, I think, covered very well. But if you look at this as a system, the recession, employers used technology to keep productivity up. If an individual has been out of a job for more than a year, year and a half, he or she probably doesn't have the technical skills to go back into that same job, much less to migrate into something else. At the same time, the increase we're talking about in investment for plant equipment is driving a demand for more skilled people. This time to market is compressing the opportunity for all of us in the workforce system, and so it's changing the value proposition somewhat. One of the things that we have done, and we've done this in collaboration with our partners at the community colleges, has been looking at a different way to do job skill analysis. this really came into practice when we were trying to help do some outplacement at Johnson Space Center. So when you come out of the Johnson Space Center and your resume says you've been a rocket scientist for 20 years, how do you relate that to something outside the fence? It turns out that the oil and gas industry was able to come in and say, if you're an engineer, you have these competencies. If you do these tasks, you have these skills. Let's map that from, say, a reservoir engineer and map it backwards. And then as you see on the slide here, the detailed work activities become the critical piece because we can train just to those skills. We can do that to a point of mastery, to a point of competence, and then get the person out into the job market. It's more fair, not only to the employer, who's able to pick up the skilled person in time to get to market, but to the job seeker, who can't sit back and say, okay, if I can go back to graduate school or I can go take 4 semesters for a certificate or something. It's very compressed. It's very, again, competency-based, mastery measured. But the time to market is what does it. And then if you put it in an environment where you have stackable certificates, then you're not only offering, again, the time to market piece, but you're developing a career path. So this, in some ways, can even mitigate the measurement of a completer, because you can phase it in over time, and if you follow up and measure that, then you can start figuring out the value of that. At the same time, it maximizes the input of the employer, because these training modules are done specifically to what a particular employer needs, whether that's change in the robotics programs at GM, building Escalades at Grand Prairie, or it's SpaceX coming into Brownsville. So this idea of what does an organization or what does a system need to look like to be innovative, I think the first one is willing to take risks. We all understand that. Failure must be acceptable. That's a difficult one for us in the public sector, because the costs of these programs, when you consider the decreasing availability of resources, at the same time the increasing cost of opportunity cost of other programs, the cost of failure starts to increase. So this is where this idea of, again, employer input, employer backing has to become part of this. And then the champions are not only the agencies, the champions have to be these public-private partnerships through this system with regional employers. So in B School, they always taught us about the 4 Ps of marketing. I've added an extra one. But the product, how do we get, the gist of this is how do we get the right person to the right place at the right time, at the right wage, the right price to do the job? And at the same time, how do we coordinate among agencies to be more than just aligned, to be joined at the hip to get this system in place and answering to the voice of the employer, the voice of the job seeker at the same time, so that we can bring them in and continue to match this unbelievable velocity in the economic development or economic system in the state. So I thought I'd throw this in just because I always do this with David, but some areas that we might look at for innovation. So small business. How do we train small business? They can't afford, if I'm training people for Dow, for Exxon, for General Motors, they can send some people to training for 2 or 3 weeks. If I'm training someone for Bubba's Battery and Tire who just picked up a contract down the Eagle Ford and needs to increase his office manager's capabilities in accounting, he can't cut her loose. But he can give her an hour off at lunch or an hour off in the afternoon to go online and study QuickBooks, whatever it may be. Community colleges offer these courses. But to have some integrated curriculum would be kind of interesting. Certainly we need on our side, and I'm hoping the commissioner's not looking at me while I'm saying this, we need to revisit the Skills Development Fund proposal development and management process. The partnership that we have through the community colleges, it's not efficient, it's effective, but it's difficult for all parties, and we need to make that quicker to market too. The integration of courses in the WECM as programs as opposed to simple courses would make the portability of these programs much easier. A community college could identify a program. There's a wonderful program down in Houston about petroleum technology that could be picked up and carried to another area of the state, much like a cafeteria plan. It could be adjusted in short order and deployed. And finally, this increased deployment of the detailed work activity methodology.
I'm sorry. When you use the acronyms, if you would explain the acronyms to our members.
The WECM is basically the state database of courses. And so everything, as I understand it, and I'm not an expert in this, I'll defer to David on this one, but the courses are all available to all the colleges. But when they're put together as programs, they're not necessarily linked as programs. And so the conversation with employers has been that we could take a program in, much like a menu, and say, what is it that you need? If it's a petroleum technology, if it's a manufacturing program. And they basically say, these courses we need, these courses we don't need, and here is a gap that we need you to fill. In which case we could go in and either look for something existing or develop that curriculum and deploy it in short order. So I apologize for the jargon. And that's really all I know about the WECM. So I think we've got a good start here. I think we're, as I've told Commissioner Paredes, we are more aligned than at the staff level than we've ever been since I've been at the state. We have programs, pilot programs, to follow up on training. We certainly have shared a lot of data in terms of the wage records and things like that. Whether we're necessarily measuring the right things so far or not, we will certainly listen to input on that. So that's what I've got, and I appreciate it. I'll be glad to. I think Mary wants to talk, and then I think the two of us would take questions. Is that? Or,
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the Council. It's my pleasure and my privilege to join you here today to give you some information about the Tuning Texas Initiative, which is a project that is being conducted by the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board with grant support from Lumina Foundation for Education. And so what I'm going to do today is to provide you with a brief overview of the project itself, to provide you with a little bit of context, and then I'm going to share with you how we are using employer survey data to help inform the tuning process, particularly with respect to the alignment of post-secondary degrees, courses, and program content with our workforce needs. So what is the Texas Tuning Project? The work actually began in 2010 when Texas began integrating the tuning process into the course alignment work that was piloted back in 2009 through the efforts of the Voluntary Mechanical Engineering Transfer Compact Committee. This work resulted, as you might recall, in the Voluntary Statewide Mechanical Engineering Transfer Compact. Now, the tuning process is actually a faculty-led project that's designed to define what students really need to know, understand, and be able to do in a chosen discipline once they have a degree in that particular discipline. It's also designed to define what students should know and be able to demonstrate at certain points along their educational pathway. The actual basic idea is to determine the body of knowledge that's needed for a discipline, and then determine the education and the experience that are needed for practice in or using that discipline. And then the fine-tuning part is designed to identify a common set of lower division courses within the discipline and then align their learning outcomes across institutions and sectors to provide a basis for voluntary transfer compacts and articulation agreements. So again, the idea is to identify and align the key lower division courses that undergraduate students need to take in order to be successful in their upper division coursework. So how is this accomplished? Faculty use their knowledge and their expertise and their academic and their professional documents, and they also use input from employers, recent graduates, and current students. And it involves faculty working together across sectors to define the degrees using active learning outcomes and then also mapping the employability of the graduates within that particular discipline. It would be across the state. No problem. The important outcome of the process itself is the vertical and horizontal curriculum alignment to enhance preparation and transferability of the students. Now, just a quick background about where we are with the project itself. In 2011, our Tuning Oversight Council for Engineering completed final tuning packages for civil, industrial, electrical, and mechanical engineering. And in 2012, we're finalizing tuning and fine-tuning work on 2 additional engineering disciplines, biomedical and chemical engineering, and 2 areas of science, biology and chemistry. And now this year we're working on mathematics, business, computer and information science, and management information systems. This work began in February of this year, and we anticipate those tuning packages to be done in 2013. So as I said, the tuning process includes surveys of students, recent graduates, faculty, and employers to identify the most important general skills and abilities, or competencies is what we're calling them, for the degree or qualification in the discipline. In other words, it's not unique to the discipline itself. So, for example, the ability to express oneself clearly in writing, or the ability to apply knowledge in practical situations. The surveys are also used to identify the level at which each of the general competencies is actually achieved by current graduates. And then the information that's gathered is used to guide the development of learning outcomes that are needed for the degree in the discipline when they are tuning that discipline. In Texas, the way we're doing it is the faculty on the tuning committees are helping to compile a list of employers who hire the graduates of their programs. And then we send these employers an email and a couple of reminders if needed to ask them to complete a 20-minute online survey to help in improving curriculum planning and course relevance for future students. And of course, we also ask them if other individuals in their organization are actually directly working with new graduates that have been hired, then maybe they would forward our link to them also so that we could get additional employers to complete the survey. And then we analyze the results and we compare the difference between perceived workplace importance and the perceived demonstration of that competency by recent graduates. And then the results are combined and then compiled and provided to the tuning committee members, and then they take the important note of those things that are judged low in achievement by recent graduates that are actually needed in the workplace. So here's an example. The first question, of course, is what is the highest role within your organization? And this shows you, these are the results of the survey that we use to gain feedback from employers of our engineering graduates. Here are their roles, as you see there. I don't really need to go into too much detail there. As you see, their higher level roles within their organizations primarily that have completed the survey. And then this is a list of the actual sectors that the individuals who completed the survey were involved with. And here are some discrepancies between what these responders see as the workplace importance of a competency and the demonstration of that competency in the workforce by recent engineering graduates. So as you'll see, you can actually refer in your materials to a more comprehensive document that has all of the competencies listed along the y-axis there, or just listed in the rows. And then we color code them to alert our tuning committee members to discrepancies between what the workplace needs and what the competence that are being demonstrated by recent graduates are. And I won't belabor the point, but as you can see here, design and manage projects was primarily the biggest discrepancy. And whether or not a student really needs to know that before they graduate from college in their discipline is up for debate, whether or not that should be something that would be taught, that the individual would gain from their employment rather than from their program. And you can see a couple of things that are pretty discrepant. Plan and manage time was one that was considered quite discrepant. So this is the idea that's fed back to the Tuning Council. Now this one shows a little bit better alignment. This shows what respondents see as better alignment between competencies needed and demonstrated by the recent graduates of these programs. And so again, I won't belabor the point, but as you can see, there is sort of pretty good alignment between some things that aren't considered that important to the workplace. So as this particular one demonstrates, these particular individuals didn't think that communication in a second language was terribly important to their particular industry, and so therefore, even though it's rated low as 17%, it also is not that well covered in the program, which isn't that problematic because there isn't a discrepancy between what's needed in the workplace and what's demonstrated by the recent graduates. There's, as I said, more information in a handout in your packet that shows the complete results of the comparison. And then I actually brought copies of the survey if you wanted to have that, but you don't necessarily need that, I don't think. Mr. Ridge says that he might be able to help us gain some input from additional employers of our graduates, which I think would be very helpful to our tuning committees and to their work. And of course, there's some websites if you want some more information about tuning. And I thank you for your attention, and I'm happy, along with Doug Ridge, to answer any questions that you might have.
Charles?
Talked about the guy that was keep working. What kind of documentation does it for you? To show that he's done what they've suggested?
We actually worked with community colleges to develop a transcript based on mastery.
I can see that in community colleges.
Yes, sir.
Probably is a similar.
Well, it was a consortium. There were 4 years, there were 2 years, there were actually private training providers involved in this that had been set up by the industry. And so all of them came together to determine what constitutes mastery in a particular task. And as the candidates would come through the process, they'd take basically a screening test. If they demonstrated mastery on day one, they moved to the next piece. At the end of it, they were given a certificate program in petroleum technology that demonstrated that they were qualified to take a particular position. And
this job doesn't work out, we'll work for another.
Yes, sir. And at the same time, and to one of your other points, most of these people to date have been offered scholarships by the potential employer to defray the cost because they need those skills. Yes, sir.
Greg?
I have a question and a comment for Mary here. When you take a look at this, the body of knowledge, particularly in engineering, a lot of the associations or institutions are looking at body of knowledge. Do we not have to be careful about what the employers are asking for? Because if I hired someone that met all this requirement over here, I can make him my chief engineer first day out of school. Because the requests are so high.
Right.
And I think we as employers have an obligation also to nurture and mentor the new graduates. So are we showing a gap that is really higher than it really is?
Actually, it's fed back into the tuning committee, and you can argue that. What happens is they determine the competencies, including those general competencies, and then discipline-specific competencies. And then amongst themselves, with all this input and everything, they determine whether or not that student should get that particular competency at the level of whatever Bloom's taxonomy might be, at what point in their educational experience, including their professional development. So I could bring up the chart, but I don't know that you'll necessarily want to see it. But along the y-axis shows the level of competency and when that student should achieve that competency. So if you were to actually look at the competency charts, there are several competencies that really aren't covered at the baccalaureate degree. And they're sometimes not covered even until the professional part. And so that whole graphic, so they will use that information to determine, like for example, managing a project would probably not be something that a student at the baccalaureate level should achieve. But that in the work, then that would be showing as part of their professional development after graduation. So I can bring it up if you would like.
I'm really glad that you made that statement, because that's something we've seen over the years. Is that most employers would like someone who would come in with the experience of somebody with 30 years strictly from,
and pay him $60,000.
That's right. That's right. And so, as Mary mentioned, the process really takes that into account. But we are getting the feedback, and part of what you're hearing today is, if you're talking about aligning with the workforce, just some things that we have in process already, and what we may build upon as we go forward to some type of measure in this area. But employers almost always want somebody that can do everything immediately, and what's a reasonable expectation
I guess
we have to get the match on.
All I'm suggesting is there has to be an adjustment, and I don't know what the judgment is that's going to go into that adjustment, but we got to consider that, because this is really frankly over the top for a 4-year or even a master's degree program. Also, one follow-up question. There's a group out there, now this only applies to architects, but called the Greenway Group, and it's a strategic planning management kind of consulting firm out of Atlanta. And they do an architectural survey. They survey architects and architectural firms, and they ask about the universities that give bachelor's degrees in architecture and master's degrees in architecture, what schools they like and what schools give them good results. It's a global survey, not into specifics like this, but it's a very interesting survey, and it's so controversial that the universities have now started to really pay attention to that and work their programs so they can get themselves up in that ranking that this organization gives them. And you might want to just check that. It's a totally different kind of survey. And if you can't find them, I can get you the contact. And
that'd be great.
Just as a context question, and then I'm going to go to Phil for a question. How did you define recent for purposes of the survey? Just graduated within the last year?
I'm sorry?
How did you define recent graduates for purposes of this survey?
Right. It's people that are hired within the last couple of years. It's not really just recent graduates, or it's within the last 2 years.
Okay. Last 2 years. Mm-hmm. So, but was that defined? In other words, I think that needs to be pinned down in a sense that there's a big difference between someone who's been working 5 years,
right,
and someone who's only out of college a year.
Good point. Right.
In terms of expectations. Phil?
Good.
Mary, what are the expectations of the coordinating board of the institutions in utilizing this study? I mean, as far as truly changing curriculum.
Well, that's the next phase of our grant project, quite frankly. It's what we're doing now is tuning these disciplines, and then we're making the compacts for the transfer. And then we're encouraging voluntary participation in the transfer compacts. then for the last year of our grant project, we're going to need to go in and actually see whether or not the curriculum is actually being affected by the work that is being done by these committees. We anticipate really that it is, because what's happening as part of this project is the academic course guide manual, the course descriptions and the learning outcomes are being specified in the academic course guide manual now. And for those of you who are not familiar with it, the academic course guide manual is the manual of academic courses that community colleges can teach and be funded by the state. And so in the previous iterations of the academic course guide manual, the idea was academic freedom and as little as possible, just to give a general overview. The problem with that is that with the transfer rates and the swirling students that we have now, a student might take Calculus 1 at one institution and then Calculus 2 at a different institution and have different learning outcomes associated with those courses. So as a part of the process, the courses are being reviewed and aligned. And the community colleges now pretty much, if that course has been aligned, that's specified in the academic course guide manual, so they are incorporating those changes into their curriculum in order to participate in these compacts and to be funded by the state.
It's important to clarify, it's the participants in the committees who are actually identifying the learning outcomes by course. Originally the project didn't have that in mind, and the faculty and administrators themselves said this isn't simply about vertical integration, which is the way we were approaching it, but it's also about horizontal integration. So if you take, say, a course in statics, it's not necessarily, the outcomes are not the same from institution to institution. And so we were very pleased that they themselves said we need to identify learning outcomes. And then from that, staff said, well, let's get in the academic course guide manual for everyone. But those who participate in the compacts are agreeing to use these as the outcomes for the courses themselves, saying they're really the equivalent to the college and career readiness standards, which say, what do you need to do to be prepared for your first course in college? These outcomes say, this is what you need to be able to do to be prepared for the next course. You have to be able to do this. And they can teach more if they want to, but they all have to at least address these specified learning outcomes that they themselves have established. So we'll see how it plays out. We actually have just designed with the group a follow-up system so that we'll see how students are actually performing in subsequent courses based upon their grades across institutions.
So you mentioned the community colleges. How about the general academic institutions?
When they sign on, and then they have to also teach.
Did voluntary to sign on?
Yes, sir.
And how many have signed on?
17 for various programs.
Out of 35?
Well, though these are engineering programs so far,
okay.
So there's
right.
So it depends on the program. How many? And I've got a calculation of exactly what percentage and all of that. If you'd like to see it.
People that offer engineering. Yeah, it's all but 2 or 3
right
institutions.
Right.
So it's become the equivalent. The one signing of the voluntary transfer compact, it varies a little bit with the field, but amounts to over 200 transfer agreements if they had been developed individually. So it's one way to while we don't get complete coverage, these institutions have bought into the system, they've participated in it, and they agree to participate and evaluate how it's working.
And I'd like to say just from San Jacinto College, our faculty have participated, and it's been a very powerful change in our curriculum. And I was nervous about the sign-on for the compact, but I was impressed as the numbers started coming together, because we were very concerned, was this really going to get that alignment and that across-the-board participation? But it's turned out to be a very powerful process for us.
Right. Well, one thing I wanted to also mention is that we do survey the faculty. So we have a very large process where we collected the email addresses of 2,930 faculty members for the final products of these four committees, and used also SurveyMonkey for them to actually assess the work of the committees in terms of the discipline-specific competencies. And my view is that also is getting the state involved, because there's a lot of participation from the faculty in at least observing what is being accomplished by their colleagues on the committees.
Harold?
You said there were 17 four-year universities that had signed on.
Right.
Does each community college then have a separate compact
No.
with all?
I actually have the information here. I brought it just in case you wanted to see it. But these are the compacts, and it's really a memorandum of understanding that the individual president of the institution agrees to these terms and conditions with respect to the compacts that have been completed. And so the community colleges sign on also. And if you would like, I'd be happy to pass those out.
I mean,
So San Jacinto is signing the same agreement as Houston
Right.
Community College, that the Austin Community College is signing, and
As are the four-years.
and Texas Tech is signing. So they're all, yes, it's the
That's the
same
beauty
agreement.
of it. It's a statewide
okay.
articulation.
That was my question. It's if they go to San Jacinto, then any of the 17 universities.
Correct.
Okay.
The idea is to help eliminate the need for these one-to-one institutional articulation agreements, because they've gotten a little bit over the top, so that it's difficult for students and counselors and parents to know if the student changes and goes to Texas Tech, for example, rather than the University of Houston, how that articulation agreement that they might have been going under would affect them over the long term.
So now an advisor at San Jac, for example, can actually have a sheet of paper which will say, if you want to go into electrical engineering, here are the courses to take, and these courses will transfer to these 17 universities.
Okay.
So they know that, and it makes the counseling much more direct.
And what are you doing about the non-participating institutions?
Well, we just sent them a letter and encouraged some participation, and got back responses as to why they might not be participating. And some of the smaller community colleges are still under the idea that they really need to offer all the courses that are included at the lower division level. So, for example, this is the transfer compact for industrial engineering. And so if they don't maybe offer electrical circuits, one, they're afraid that they might not be able to sign on. But they sign on for the courses that they're teaching, and that they agree to teach them to the course description and the learning objectives. With respect to the bigger universities, specifically Texas A&M and UT Austin is still looking at the compact to determine the admission standards, how it will affect them, because one of the problems is that they have so many applicants that they can't treat transfer students better than they can their own native students who are already admitted into the university, but just not into the UT engineering program. And Texas A&M has sent a very long explanation about their curriculum needs and how it could impact them. So there are institutions that are frankly waiting to see how the assessment process pans out. They're a little bit concerned about their ABET accreditation and all of that, so they want to make sure that we truly are assessing, and we're going to be using the student schedule data to determine, as David said, how a student, for example, that did in Calculus 1 at XYZ institution, how they did, that individual student, at an institution to which they transferred and took Calculus 2. So it'll be a part of this whole process, and frankly, I believe that once we get that going and have reports going out to the institutions to show them how their students are actually doing, that more institutions will feel more comfortable about signing on.
2 points about this. One is that the statewide articulation agreements have absolutely no bearing on individual institutions' admission standards. So there's no requirement to lower any admission standards by any institution. So that's a false argument. Secondly, in interim legislative hearings, the question has been asked, how well are these voluntary compacts working, and do they need to become mandatory? So the more successful the voluntary compact, the less the need for the legislature to perhaps mandate them. Mary, have we sent out statewide articulation agreements that are in final draft yet, or is that?
Yes, sir.
The ChemE, the biomedical engineering, yes. Biology, chemistry?
Those are forthcoming. Actually, what's going to
So we have not yet sent those to the institutions?
Correct. The ones that are out now are civil, electrical, industrial, and mechanical, and the next set will go out in November after the Academic Course Guide Manual Committee reviews the work of the council with respect to the fine-tuning of the courses that are involved in biomedical engineering, chemical engineering, biology, and chemistry. And then those will all go into the academic course guide manual, assuming that they adopt the recommendations of the council. And then we'll have another set of these. Actually, what we plan to do is just add them to this one.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. Members, further questions? Jerry?
This is for Doug. And I really like your chart here that's got the listen to the customer. And you hit a nerve with the Johnson Space Center thing with me, but it would fit other situation. You're trying to map cross skills back to from, say, space to petroleum.
Yes, sir.
Do the users, do the companies also have some programs like Dr. Carnival talked about where industry-based certification for that backward mapping rather than a community college or a four-year institution? That's my first question, so go ahead. Yeah.
They certainly do. And one of the trends that we're seeing, and I think Dr. Heather will agree with me on this, is a continuing or an increasing investment by industry in specific private training programs, partly because of cycle time. There are a lot of reasons for them to do it, but yes, we're in that particular program. We worked with a private training provider to take those skill sets and bring them into this collaborative training environment. We are required by law to do our training through the community colleges.
Right.
And so that was the funding stream. They built the collaborative partnerships, and then we brought the employers together.
So the industry actually partners with the community college, too.
Yes, sir.
Okay, good. And this would fit other areas as well, but I know in the aerospace business, fluid dynamics, you fly around and it's a fluid. It's different than petroleum product.
Yes, sir.
But I would think that someone very good in fluid dynamics in the space application could more easily fit into maybe the petroleum side of it, or the petroleum side of the industry, easier than somebody like a double E or maybe a CE or something. So my question is, are those kind of things taken into account in trying to construct what someone needs to make that cross?
Yes, sir.
Because it's not a one-size-fits-all. It would have to be tailored, I would think, to different disciplines.
That's exactly right. And it's not just in the petroleum industry. When you start talking about fluid dynamics, I'm sitting here thinking about a project we're doing with GM and commercializing the Robonaut technologies into advanced manufacturing lines. And the application of that to all kinds of hostile manufacturing environments. So the first taker on that is a major chemical company who is doing exactly the kind of analysis you're talking about. That's been one of the big areas of interest. The other has been in reservoir engineering, where certainly fluid flow is part of that too. But and there's been a lot of movement at the technician level, who may or may not be a degree-bearing person. In this case, usually is, but is not an advanced scientist. And there's been a lot of movement and gap training based on that through this same sort of analysis.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
More questions? Doug, I forgot to warn you that, and the rest of the council, that we have not one but two rocket scientists on this council. 2 out of 3 Aggies on this council are rocket scientists, and I think you can guess who they are.
I say Aero.
They're sitting over there together at that
Aero majors.
Well, it's all about the transition, whether it's aerospace or the SEC.
Well, lest we dive into football, Pam, did you have a
I
question?
do have one question. Back to, Ray, thank you for asking that question a minute ago. How did we come up with a list of competencies that you ask the employers about, because in some ways you shape their expectations by asking for certain competencies that may not align with what the curriculum or what the experts who teach these things are necessarily doing, and you're shaping the expectation of the employer in some ways. And I just wonder how you come up with that list.
Well, we actually did it through, as a result of, part of this tuning process, there were 3 pilot states, Minnesota, Utah, and Indiana. And the idea really of the surveys is also not only to consider what employers' feedback is, but also what recent graduates and students and faculty think these competencies are. And then the idea also, besides what you're seeing here, is to compare what the faculty might think are the most important workplace competencies with those of the students and the recent graduates. So what we ended up doing in Texas when we first started our pilot project was to conglomerate the work that had been done by these other states and compare the surveys that they were using across, and then we chose what we thought was, of those, the best of them. And it changed it just a little bit, but frankly we used the Minnesota survey because primarily for the competencies because of the way that they had set it up. Frankly, it's all changeable. It's just that at the way that we've got it structured so far, the committee members get the results of these 4 groups with respect to these competencies, and to see whether or not there's disparities amongst the stakeholders themselves also.
Did the faculty have any input into the selection of questions, or did they just get that secondarily?
They got it secondarily, based on the work that had been done in other states.
So I think what Ms. Williford is saying is something that we need to look at for the future surveys, is to make sure there's more input from the faculty members in the selection of the questions.
And maybe employers.
See, I was going to add to that, how much do they align with the DWAs?
That's the interesting question that we had to wrestle with, is where do you start? And so we actually started at the most granular level we could get to. What is the actual task that this person has to carry out? And then worked up. To be able to do that, what does this person have to know? So you go from the activity to the knowledge to the skills and abilities, and from there those aggregated into competencies. And that was really our model. It's a little bit different. It's the same concept. The difference was that we started with the employer saying, if you want to fill this job, tell me at a very granular level what this person needs to do. And then we were able, at that level, to start the matching. That was the key to our gap analysis.
But I think we have to be careful, because what the employer wants on day one and what's realistic might be 2 different things. And I don't know if you saw the article recently, but some of these companies are putting their acceptance of resumes on a computer system. And so in one of the large companies, an executive, I don't know what level, filled out an application for his company. And he didn't even qualify for the job he currently occupied, based on what was happening in the HR profile. So we really have to be careful here, I think, with some of this.
Got it.
A lot of it is must-haves and nice-to-haves, and you know.
Mm-hmm. Well, and again, if you take it down to what does the person actually do in that position, then you're able to build in how much of this is I really wish this person could do that, versus how much does this actually happen in a workday. We've had the same problem with testing our databases, and some of our directors were not, of course there was some question about that anyway. We're trying to figure out how to build this detailed work activities module into our resume writer on our Work in Texas project, because that way we can more closely align this knowledge, skills, and abilities model as opposed to a job title model.
It occurs to me as you're discussing this, we haven't really done any analysis based upon even the respondent. So you have a wide range. The CEO versus a human resource manager, Mr. Messer mentioned, they may have different views of the position. The line manager who's actually working directly with a person versus someone else. And so I think we need to look at how to do that better as we go forward.
This strikes me as one of the greatest areas of cooperation between our agency and TWC is aligning the two approaches to gap analysis and employer expectations/satisfaction.
And frankly, we could use more employers, because one of the issues that we're having is just a lot of the engineering employers are being used for the ABET accreditation, so the professors are a little reluctant to share really specific individual emails with us, because they don't want to over-survey and then the folks won't fill them out for their ABET accreditation needs. So if we could work with the Texas Workforce Commission to get these out and design better surveys.
Here's one employer right here who will provide you direct feedback.
And one thing we've learned in recent months as we've been preparing for this meeting is the things that TWC has been doing in terms of the skills gap. We knew they were doing, but we didn't know fully, and that we're beginning to identify some ways we can work more closely together on that. Because some things I was thinking we ought to do, I found from Doug they're already doing to some extent. So we don't want to duplicate efforts, but learn more. So we appreciate Doug.
Well, the partnership is the critical success factor here. Again, we have fewer resources that we can deploy right now. We have to be more targeted, more effective, more efficient. At the same time, we have a metric for stewardship of public funds, so we have to make sure that we're delivering value back into these client bases, whether it's a job seeker or an employer. And education and training are critical to that success.
That's very well said. I have one final question, but are there any other members who have a question for either Mary or Doug? Doug, my last question for you really goes back to some information we heard from Dr. Carnevale about sort of disaggregating that well-known target of 63-64% of the workforce having post-secondary attainment. Were you here? Did you hear when I asked you to divide the pie? Does the TWC's projections for employment, does that align with how he divided it? 30% BA, less than 10%, say 7 to 8 or more graduate, and then the roughly 12% AA, 12% certificates. How does that mesh with?
I'm sure that's fairly close. The difference in the way we look at it, at least in my office, and perhaps the labor economist, is the degree of churn and what is the longevity of that degree. As when we started down this way 10 years ago, the pipeline was pretty easy to define. It was a continuous process for K-12 and then into some next step, whether it was the service or community college or 4-year, whatever it may be, or straight to a job. Now there are so many exit points and re-entry points and requalification points. And I think of all the things I heard Dr. Carnevale say, the most interesting was the graduates who were coming back for certificates. If you were, back to one of the points I made, if you were a geologist 20 years ago, you did not have the competency to work in the Eagle Ford Shale. If you were a mechanical engineer, you probably could not work on the line at GM right now. So the integration of this model is different now. The barrier to entry, for lack of a better term, is constantly ramping up, and the time available both for the employer and the job seeker, as well as for us as the deliverers of service, is also compressing. So the churn, I think, is much more dynamic than the numbers of graduates or qualifiers at a particular point. But I'll be glad to get you the estimates on that from our labor market people. I'm sure they're close.
That would be very helpful, because as closing the gaps, we set a goal for X number of of degrees by 2015. I think as we go forward by 2030, and this will have to be reviewed every 5 years because it's very dynamic and changing, of course. But I think one of the biggest concerns that we've seen is this what I perceive as an unnecessary debate between what the coordinating board's goals are vis-a-vis a college-going culture and Commissioner Alcantar's predecessor, with whom I and our commissioner had some constructive debate of the perception for career and technical education and the needs for that. And so our 2030 plan, I think needs to disaggregate what we're targeting at each of those levels of attainment. It sounds like we also need maybe a better tool for measuring the churn, perhaps the average number of attainments per worker or something along those lines.
I think that would be something perhaps in the tuning project where you go back and you ask the employer, what is the shelf life of this competency? How much has this changed over the last X number of years? As technologies change, we look at NASA and talk about the things that are, we look at them as an engine of change. Those engines are coming out outside the fence now and are being adopted and commercialized and are changing the way people do their jobs. It's a different game. Manufacturing is coming back, especially to Texas. That's going to change the way we do daily tasks. And so whether you have a job or you don't have a job, you have to look at the skill sets you have. And we as a system need to make available, whether it's a professional CLE level or some kind of continuing education level, or through the community colleges, or when we developed the WIN program up at Texas Tech in concert with the governor's office and Tech, we put in a graduate certificate program so that people who wanted to move into that industry could. How much do engineers know about meteorology? How much do they need to know? How much do meteorologists know about turbine design? Things like that. So these options, and again, people were able to walk in, take a mastery level test on day one. If they passed it, they took something else and get them into jobs.
Well, I think the takeaway from what I'm hearing from both of these panels is that while we both here in Texas and in the federal level have talked a lot, particularly with Woody's efforts on behalf of the Texas Business Leadership Council, have talked a lot about reaching, at least by 2030, if not sooner, that 60% of the workforce age population holding some attainment. But what this tells us is that number is not one and the same with the number of degrees, attainments, that the workforce needs. It'll be some higher multiple. That 60% will need to have an average of whatever it is, 1.5 attainments or what have you. Commissioner?
One of the things that hasn't been said this morning, surprisingly, because it's one of the things that Carnevale talks about regularly, is that young people today in the K-12 pipeline are going to have to commit themselves to a lifetime of education, re-education, retraining. There is, we know that people that are coming through the pipeline will change careers likely in the range of 3 or 4 times during their lifetimes. And I don't mean changing your job from being a teacher in El Paso to being a teacher in Austin. I'm talking about doing a very different job from what you had done previously. So what you're talking about, the churn and the fact that a geologist trained 20 years ago may not be competent to work in today's energy environment, is precisely what is happening in virtually every field. And we need to make young people understand that that's the future, that education, continuing education will be the norm. And that the data show that over and over and over again.
Couldn't agree more. The one point I would add to that, if I may, real quick, is that we need to make them aware of this whole matrix it's not a career ladder anymore. It's a career matrix. And you can bounce back and forth all the way to the top, learning different parts of your particular profession. It's a very different game.
Well, I think one of the things that this next long-range plan, beyond closing the gaps, we're recognizing is it really needs to be a shared sort of a full pipeline plan and set of goals. And by that I mean, from public education through post-secondary and on into the workforce. We need to have the goals and the measurements broader than we have before because of these reasons. Commissioner, and then I think Ray had a question.
I think Ray was first.
Well, I was just going to make a comment. It would be, and I think you guys alluded to it a bit, it'd be very important that the K through 12 system start addressing this very early in these young people's lives then. Not wait till they're seniors in high school and inform them, oh, by the way, as you launch into your next phase of your life, you need to consider this. It's too late then.
We have been working on that point. May I take a couple of minutes to go over these two PowerPoint presentations that we had passed out to you just a few minutes ago?
Sure.
I thought these would help elaborate on some of the points that you've heard this morning. If you take a look at the one that's entitled Education for What? The Rise in Demand for Skill and the Decline of Manual Labor, I should say that these two PowerPoints were presented at the annual meeting of the State Higher Education Executive Officers meeting in Seattle a week and a half ago. And I thought these PowerPoints would be very interesting. For example, if you look at the one I just referred to, if you look at on the second page, you can see very clearly what the differential is in earning depending on level of education. If you look on page 3, the bottom slide, you see that skilled blue-collar supervisors and clerical jobs have been steadily declining for a significant period of time, over 50 years, and you can see that managers and professions have been steadily increasing. If you look, once again, I just want to point out some highlights that underscore some of the points that have been made this morning. If you look at the next series of slides, the one that's entitled The Future for Educated Workers in the United States Economy, this was prepared by some employment and labor force experts at McKinsey & Company. And once again, very quickly, look on page, well, the pages aren't marked, but it's slide number 4. It's that bar chart. And once again, you see that there's not only a significant relationship between education and wages, but there's also a significant relationship between unemployment rates and levels of education. And you see the anomaly that all of us in higher education are concerned about right now. Clearly, if you look at the unemployment rate for college graduates, it's fairly low, 4.2%, but for recent college graduates, it's more than 3 times as high. We have to deal with that issue. Once again, if you look on at slide 10 and 11, you see that the American economy is changing very dramatically. The American economy is becoming much more productive so that you can have an expansion of the economy without a significant increase in jobs. You can also see that another critical issue that we have to deal with, and this is an issue from which we could really use guidance from this council, how to deal with the mismatch. The availability of jobs of fields in which there are significant shortages and the lack of college-trained, high school-trained individuals who have the skills to fill those jobs. Then once again, this I think is particularly important. If you look at slide 15, this projects where the jobs will be for what levels of training, and you can see that where the jobs will increase and what the value of those jobs is. And then on the next page, slide 17, you see what level of training will be needed in the United States over the next period of time. For example, you can see that we do not have a surplus of people who don't have a high school degree, and you can see, for example, that we have a much greater need for people who have certificates. That's what some college no degree means. It refers primarily to people who hold certificates. And you can see we're going to have a huge shortage of people who hold certificates. We will have a surplus of people who have associate's degrees. And those are typically associate's degrees in liberal arts fields and so forth, social sciences. And then we'll have a very substantial shortage of trained people who hold bachelor's degrees or above. But I thought that these two PowerPoints would complement what you've heard in the presentations this morning.
Yeah, it's good information. I'd like to see this information, these two PowerPoints, and really what we've had this morning shared with the other 8 members of our board as well.
Absolutely.
As Harold and myself. So, any questions for what Raymond just reviewed? It's good data. We have one more panel before breaking for an early lunch, and that panel just lost 5 minutes of their time. And that is a presentation by Lee Holcomb, our director of the Higher Ed Policy Institute. It's a preview on some research that Lee is doing for us in an effort to answer the question, what a degree should cost. And I don't know, it's a preview, so the answer is not wrapped up in a neat little bow yet, but it'll give you an idea of where we're headed with this research.
It's a bow, but it's not a neat bow. Not that. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, council members. It's a pleasure speaking to you this morning. As Fred mentioned, this is a preview. Fred, I'd like a little bit of guidance. If we want to start at 11:45, you want me to condense this even further? It might be a good idea because we are going to have a chance to discuss this in the small groups, and I'm going to stick around for that.
Okay.
So I'm going to ask David and the Commissioner to hold on their seats. I'm going to suggest that I get to the nuts and bolts and reduce my presentation even further.
Condense as best you can. I can't account for how many questions the members may have of you.
Okay. So let me emphasize this is a preview. What I'm going to be presenting is basically how we're going about looking at what a degree should cost. I'm going to be looking at the short term and the long term. We're going to have a few minutes here to discuss the approach, and we're going to have, as I just mentioned, a chance to talk about it in the small group discussion. The short-term approach is what I'm going to be spending most of my time on, and then I'm going to end with a few concluding remarks on the longer-term version. And I'm also restricting my focus, at least for now, to the 4-year degree. Now, we've done some analysis so far on the 2-year approach. We can talk about it more in depth, and perhaps the discussion and then the small group discussion, small groups. But I'm going to ask you to turn your attention to slide 4, and let's get going into the methodology. We've done an internal analysis of using our internal data, looking at all first-time 4-year entrants in Texas public higher ed institutions, and followed them for 6 years to 2010. And so much of what I'm going to be presenting is based upon analysis of that data. The nice thing about that data is it's based upon actual student. Yes, sir. Oh.
Transportation of traditional.
Well, we're using the cost data that we have and student enrollment data. And so we're joining the enrollment data. It's all costs. It's all costs. No, sir. This is basically data that captures, instructional.
Academic costs.
Academic costs, right. So it's total academic costs.
Does not include room and board and.
Does not include room and board.
Okay. Yeah, that's a good question.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for that clarifying question. The nice thing about basing this methodology upon actual student behavior is that it facilitates the identification of impacts of specific recommendations on cost to degree. So what we've done is we've culled the literature on recommendations that you can actually implement to try to improve efficiencies. There's a number of sources from that based upon, we had the cost efficiency report that we did a couple of years ago. McKinsey's been very active in this arena. Baines has been very active in this arena. And there's some other sources as well. We estimate the impacts of implementing those recommendations on the cost to degree in Texas. This is a 5-year target. This is what we're calling the short-term analysis, and I think therefore should be considered more of basically tweaking what the current model is. The longer term, in contrast, I think is more consideration of more transformational models and the impacts that those might have on cost to degree. So moving on to recommendations, let me go ahead and. The overarching recommendation in the cost efficiency report is to reduce the cost to degree by 10%. And this was what the members of the advisory council thought was a reasonable reduction of cost to degree within a short term. So that's one that we look at. In addition to that recommendation, there's a number of other recommendations that are more specifically focused on state policies and actual actions that institutions can take to help achieve those efficiencies. Performance-based funding, for example, that wasn't passed obviously in 2011. It's on the table for discussion in 2013. Semester credit hours to degree is a prime driver of efficiencies. And so we're going to take a look at what would happen if we reduce semester credit hours to degree to approximately 135.
From an average of 147.
Yes, and so basically what we did was in that cohort we looked at, there's about 48% of the students in that cohort required more than 135 semester credit hours to graduate. That's just among the completers. So what was the efficiencies realized by bringing those down to 135? Increasing the credit hours produced per faculty member, basically the teaching workload per faculty member. That's been a topic of a lot of discussion, how you incorporate technologies into the classroom to both increase the efficiency as well as increase student learning. Closing low-producing programs, that's something that the agency's been already working with institutions in doing, but it's not just a one-time process. It's a process. It's just not a one-time action. And streamlining administrative processes can entail a number of different strategies that are actually listed in the cost efficiency report, further expanding purchasing pools. Yes, sir.
Real quick question. At the committee 2 years ago, the Cost Efficiency Committee, there was a presentation about 125 hours. Mm-hmm. Where's the discrepancy there? Are we talking about apples and apples or not?
Well, let me respond to that question. Ray, the reason we're thinking of a 135 target, and once again, this is a preliminary recommendation. It may be that we wish to go lower. We know that there's a significant percentage of students, for example, in the range of 10%, who double major. Okay. And they do that consciously to make themselves more competitive, more marketable. So this would allow, 15 hours would allow for those students that double major without penalizing them.
I might argue that some of the programs in the STEM curriculums, for example, that 125 is not adequate and 135 would be barely adequate.
Yeah, there are definitely exceptions.
Yeah, well, I think what you said was an average, not the maximum.
Well, that's another point I was going to make is that right now the state averages for completers, the state averages for graduates is 147 credit hours. So if we're targeting a maximum of a 135, and we can debate whether that's the right or wrong number, the average may well be lower than 135.
Yeah, and let me explain what we mean when we say a maximum 135 hours. We're not saying that students can't take more hours than that. We're saying that we are considering making a recommendation to the board that students who accumulate more than 135 hours in course credit for a 120-hour degree would be required to pay out-of-state tuition for those additional hours.
So if they took 145 for a 140-hour degree, then they would pay out-of-state tuition for the extra 5.
No, we would prorate the numbers upward for students who are in degree programs that require more than 120 hours.
I think you both just said the same.
Yeah.
So, and one thing that I would like
there currently is a law that sets this at a higher number. So essentially, what the commissioner is talking about is lowering that
Changing
threshold.
the statute.
Because right now, the move is for most, if not all, degrees to be 120 semester credit hours. So it allows some overage, as the commissioner was saying, but beyond that point, state law right now requires that they pay out-of-state tuition. This would lower the threshold when that would happen.
And one thing that I would like to point out is that this is obviously looking right now at statewide averages, but we actually have the capability to look at field-specific values. So we can take into account the various differences in semester credit hours to degree by field. So, these recommendations come from, as I mentioned, a number of different sources, and I think they can be considered, part of the list of usual suspects that you see across the literature, and also are the recommendations that have the estimated largest impacts. So, what we're going to be showing here is sort of the big fish and the estimated impacts of the big fish in terms of cost to degree, which is on the next slide. What should a 4-year degree cost? And the baseline cost to 4-year degree, as you see, is in that cohort is $67,765. And a portion of, I show the portion of which is paid by students, state, and other sources as well. And then if you take a look at the estimate for what would happen if we reduce cost of degree by 10%, I'm calling that the conservative estimate. Actually, you'd like to use the term boundary. Reduces that cost of degree to approximately $61,000 per degree. And again, I've got the estimated student distribution there right underneath it. Underneath that, yes, sir?
Since it's a major, in fact, the largest of the 3 components, can you explain what's included in other?
Thank you.
Student and state.
Basically, other is institutional and federal sources. So, and the student figure is net tuition and fees. So it's tuition fees after scholarships and grants.
So scholarships and grants would either be in the state or the other category. Okay.
So then what I've done is I've gone through and I've estimated for each of the policy or strategies the effect of what the reduced cost degree would be if that strategy were implemented in isolation. And then I got an adjusted total effect. And I refer to that as an adjusted total effect because some of these are related and they overlap, right? So it would be a mistake to just do a simple sum. And I estimate that to be approximately 17.3 adjusted total effect in percentage terms, which reduces it down to 56,000. And I'm calling this the ambitious estimate, or it's the ambitious boundary. And you get an estimate of the distribution, the portion of that cost of degree that would be borne by students, state, and other right underneath it. So I think that the important point here is to consider what the approach in terms of the boundaries. We've got basically a conservative boundary that we're looking at, and we're also looking at an aggressive boundary. Continued work on this will be looking at the estimates for the impacts themselves, as well as consideration of additional recommendations in the short term. And again, this gets back to this is really tweaking the current model in 5 years out. And now I'd like to talk and conclude about what the approach that we might use looking at 2030. In the next slide. When you talk about 2030, it gives you an opportunity to think more about, what is the actual vision for higher ed that far out. and how does that vision apply to each institution? How does it relate to projections for the drivers of efficiency and the plan to get there? So it allows us to consider the new models for higher education and their associated values for the drivers. So, for example, we've got a very innovative new program in competency-based education started here at the agency in collaboration with a couple of four-year institutions that are based upon, give you a competency-based four-year degree. So, to what extent by 2030 is this new model going to be the new normal? Right? And I mean, how is that question answered for each institution? And to give you an example, the cost per semester credit hour for WGU, which is a competency-based program, is substantially less than what we currently have in Texas public institutions, $230 compared to over $300, right? Well, if you took in that cohort of analysis and set the cost per semester credit hour to $230, you would reduce the cost of degree in the cohort of analysis that we analyzed by 30%, almost over $20,000, right? So obviously, that kind of conversation is not possible to have in the short term. But you start thinking long term, and I think you start it seems to make more sense to consider those types of possibilities. Also in the long term, this is reference to what Professor Carnevale mentioned the importance of student learning. And this was also mentioned by some of the presentations we heard from the OECD folks. The emphasis on degrees is in part because we don't really have good measures for what students are learning. And I think that I think in the next 5 years or so, I think we're going to get to that point where we can perhaps start having the cost to core completion, for example. Now we've got a better defined core curriculum in the state. Number one. Then number two, in a couple of previous meetings, or in meetings 2 meetings ago, I discussed the Student Learning Compact, where the purpose of which would be within a couple of years to have each institution identify general learning outcomes for its students and meaningful measures for those general learning outcomes. And once we get to that point, we can start getting to a cost of qualified degree, which would be defined as a graduate who has satisfied the general learning outcomes for that institution. In addition, capital financing, in the cost efficiency report, there was a number of long-term recommendations that were in that report that were difficult to estimate the impacts of in the short-term analysis. But when we're starting to look down the line at 2030, we can look at more structural changes. Capital financing is simply an example of that. So that concludes my remarks, and I'm happy to entertain any questions now and, of course, in the discussion section.
Could you maybe go back? You skipped your slide 3 where you're talking about room for improvement, because one of the key cost drivers is essentially the students who don't complete, not just students who take more, and you passed over that without mentioning that.
Well, on slide 3, I make the case that there is room for improvement in looking at the various drivers. So, for example, looking at this cohort of analysis from 2004 to 2010, there was approximately $2.1 spent on the entire cohort. $648 million of which was spent on students who never completed. That's almost 30%. So attrition is clearly a driver of efficiency. So many of these recommendations that we're talking about are designed to actually reduce attrition. Okay?
So, Lee, the baseline cuts to clarify, because this, David, I'm glad you brought this up. I was going to ask this question. The $67,765 baseline is the cost of all expenditures divided by actual completed degrees?
Yes. Right. So it takes into account non-completers.
Okay.
So we can get we also have values for the cost to completer and cost to non-completer, and then cost to degree, which accounts for both cost for completers and non-completers.
And it's just the money spent on those 62,000 people in the cohort. So
right.
Other people enrolled after that point, they're not included in the dollar figures.
Right.
It's just for those 62,000.
And it's measured at the 6-year graduation point?
Yes.
Oh, 4 to 10.
We cover them for 6 years, right.
Okay.
So then the idea was we could repeat this analysis for subsequent cohorts and see how we're progressing.
So it is an apples-to-apples method, but it's what it wouldn't catch is that we have seen at a few institutions there is, if not dramatic, there's meaningful increases in graduation when measured at 10 years. And for some that's very small, but for some institutions they might get another 10% of graduates or something.
Mm-hmm. And the data is available for Lee to extend through 10 years. We periodically track students 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
Frankly, I don't know if that would help or hurt.
Well, I think that the idea is that we would repeat this analysis on subsequent cohorts, and I think what you would do is look for change over time within whatever given window that you look at. That's the key, right? So, and similarly, the semester credit hours to degree, if we had reduced the semester credit hours to degree for this cohort of analysis, it would result in about $141 million in savings. The average cost per semester credit hour increased from 2006 to 2010 by approximately 15% in four-year institutions. Had that not occurred, we would have saved about $250 million. So these are three very important drivers of efficiency, which we account for explicitly in our methodology.
Lee, taking into the discussion on the non-completers and just what you said, and then also looking at the savings from streamlining administrative processes, increasing faculty teaching loads, closing low-producing programs, limiting the number of hours to degree. Doesn't that all point back to the performance funding system and to incentives? In other words, couldn't we accomplish everything if we had robust incentives both at the institutional level and at the student level to try to drive completions up, degree less, and then not have to micromanage the issues on number of hours, teaching load? In other words, if you incentivize the institution appropriately, they can incentivize the faculty to increase their load. If you incentivize the students appropriately, maybe you can get more completers out of the same number of dollars. So shouldn't that really be the focus? Can't you do it with incentives and not? My concern on the micromanagement, it always has unintended consequences. It's a bureaucratic, another rule that needs to be enforced and administered, and you've got all the intended costs that goes with that, whereas a focus on incentives properly done, and maybe it's something greater than what we envision today, is really the best way to get the cost per completer down, which is really what I think the appropriate goal ought to be from state policy.
Yeah, the only problem I've never been able to figure out how you motivate the students. Well, I can figure out how you can motivate the administration and the faculty.
There were some ideas thrown out earlier about
I'd like to hear
out-of-state tuition over a certain number of hours, allowing changing policy on Texas grants and other student financial aid to be available only for 30 credit hours a year and 4 years
Let me
max.
give you another point of view.
I think there are ways.
Purpose of discussion here. If a cost of the degree is $67,000, and you look at the average wage income of the middle class in Texas, it's where that is, you're going to see that most families are not going to be able to afford this tuition. So it falls on the kid. So the kid then has got to figure out a way to try to go to work part of the time to try to complete. And that's the piece that I don't think we talk about enough.
Well, we don't talk about the other piece, which is as the state, if we want a competitive workforce, are we willing to invest? And by we, collectively, are we willing to invest in making that happen?
You and I are on the same page.
Which has a whole other implication.
It's another conversation.
Taxing and who pays for that investment.
But as I sat here and listened to this today, I'd never seen this number. This is a really interesting number to me. I think the legislature ought to see this number.
That's the purpose of this research.
Oh, I understand. Because it's got to shock every person there. But Texas Grants is covering what percentage of the kids that are qualified? In other words, I'm saying there's a whole lot of kids that are not going to be. You're not going to be able to meet the goals that we're talking about unless you figure out how to pay for it. It's not any way.
Yeah, and Dr. Carnavelli got to the point. He said we had the second biggest. Actually, on a relative basis, we have the biggest challenge because of our demographics of our state. Absolutely, maybe it's second because we're smaller, much smaller than California. He implied that the country ought to be, and I guess through through certain financial aid policies, the country does participate. But
good luck on that.
We do have an investment challenge there, and whether it's met by the country or by the state, it's hard to see how we're going to close the gap without.
Absolutely.
But you can't have investment, at least in my view, unless you've got policies in place that can point to a much higher level of productivity, rather than just putting dollars into the same policies that have not performed at a high level of productivity. So at least that would be my argument.
Yeah, good point, good statement. Jerry?
You skipped over Chart 2, which I think has got a compelling story in it that Texas is not doing too bad.
Right.
Now, we can always get better, but isn't WGU all online?
It's a competency-based online model.
To compare that degree, which probably okay for certain applications, to a degree from UT Austin, I don't think you're in different ball games. It's a different domain. So I think we can take some, I don't know what you call it, maybe satisfaction in the fact that based against our peers, it appears that Texas is not bad. So let's don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. I think and I also know that universities have their own cost-cutting ideas going on right now. That
Absolutely.
I know the UT framework and A&M's got Elaine's effort going. And so I think we got to be a little careful here that we don't get a metric in our mind that we've got to reduce by X number of dollars or X number of percentage. We certainly ought to drive it as low as we possibly can, and we've got to have, without affecting the quality too badly. We may nip it a bit in the process if we're not careful. Probably going to, even if we're careful, we're going to nip that quality a little. But I think we got to be careful that we don't set an arbitrary goal in mind and then say if we don't reach that, we've failed. We haven't done too bad so far.
Well, but that's too bad compared to the peer states who are also in trouble in terms of the sustainability.
Absolutely, I'm not
funding.
arguing that, and I wouldn't. I think we do have to drive it as low, and times are changing. But I just think we got to be a little.
But I would agree with you. I don't think we could afford to nick the quality even a little. We've got to maintain the quality.
Well, and I think
I hope we don't.
I guess it depends on how we define quality as well. But
and I think there's. As I mentioned in the 2030 perspective, I think we can start getting at student learning and looking at how student learning is changing over time and the cost to student learning, which is critical. Right?
Can I tell one story real quick? My grandson's about to graduate from U of H. The only courses that he didn't like, and he said he didn't really learn much, were the online courses that he took. So we haven't got that right yet, at least for one Griffin. I don't know how the other he's not a brilliant student anyway, but so he had to work at it.
He's going to say, "Gee, thanks, Grandpa."
And I'd like to follow up on your comment in regards to comparing UT to WGU. And I think one of the things that I'd like to emphasize is going into 2030. This envisioning what higher ed's going to look like has to occur on an institution by institution basis, and then consider what the efficiency implications are for what that vision is. Right. I mean, and so it goes beyond student learning. I mean, there are some certain institutions like UT and A&M specifically that have a very definite culture that they're trying to impart upon their students that are designed to carry them, follow them through.
Right.
Well, to what are the cost implications of that culture and doing that? Maybe that is a non-negotiable. Maybe it's not, or maybe that could be done in more efficient ways. So these are the kinds of conversations that, in the long term, I think need to occur. In addition to looking at the effects on student learning, which of course are critical.
Right. Commissioner?
Peace.
I'm sorry.
I wanted to respond to Jerry's point. Jerry, we included this chart for precisely the reason you indicated, that Texas is, by some indicators, much more efficient than other states. In fact, the McKinsey study, and we circulated a summary of that McKinsey study I think at 2 meetings of this group ago, showed that there's a built-in, according to their work, there's a built-in cost inefficiency in higher education between 15 and about 30%. And looking at this chart, we concluded in a very general way, a very soft way, that we were probably close to the low end of that inefficiency spectrum. That's why our goal is 10% reduction in cost rather than 30% reduction in cost. In regard to the issue of quality, there's no evidence that one delivery mode is inherently superior to another. There are some students who learn perfectly well doing all their work online. There are others who don't learn well at all online, typically younger students, typically less self-motivated students. And the research shows that the bulk of students, at least right now, seem to learn best with a combination of blended and face-to-face and online instruction. What we're trying to do now in Texas is, because we have such an extraordinary range of demographics, is we want to create different higher education opportunities for students in different circumstances and different means. The low-cost degree, the high-quality, low-cost degree will not be for everybody, but it will provide a way of getting a higher education credential to students who cannot go to school full-time, who cannot be in residence at a university like A&M or UT or Texas Tech or Texas State San Marcos. So what we are trying to do is put together a variety of opportunities to meet the needs of all the students who are interested in some sort of higher education credential in Texas. For example, competency-based instruction, which is relatively new, is based on the simple concept that there is absolutely no research that shows that everybody needs 15 weeks of seat time in a classroom to master a body of knowledge. There are some who would master a body very aggressively in a much shorter period of time if given the opportunity. And that's what competency-based instruction does. You have a body of material that you have to master. Once you think you've mastered it, you take some very rigorous final exams like you do in virtually any university class. And if you pass the material, you move on to the next class. And there's no doubt that that kind of delivery model is much more effective for working adults, single parents, and so forth. So that's what we're trying to do. We're not going to compromise the mission or the character of residential universities. What we want to do is provide more opportunities for a broader range of students, many of whom are different from the traditional students who go to those kinds of institutions. That's what we're trying to do.
I agree with everything you say, too. I think that's exactly where we've got to get.
Yeah.
I just think we need to keep in mind that, you know, and particularly the media, the politicians, others pick up the idea that, oh, we're going to just do everything online, and boy, we're going to make this thing a lot cheaper.
We're going to fold up our campuses.
We're going to fold up. That's right. And my point is that it needs to have that balance. You described it very well. You described it exactly like it needs to be described. So I agree with everything you say.
Yeah. There will always be a market and a demand for that traditional four-year residency experience, you know. But it's just, you know, what we're trying to do is add other options because of the growth we need to, you know, to reach. That demand probably won't shrink. It'll increase too, but not as much as the demand for these other tools. And the last reason, and we will have a chance to talk about this in small groups, so the last reason that I've encouraged the agency to do this research is because we need to change the tenor and the topic of the discussion in the legislature.
Absolutely.
From one of continually talking about cutting costs versus spending more to what are the numbers, how are we doing, and what is an appropriate target for spending, and where then we can talk about where those revenue sources
that's really been missing
need to be.
from the debate.
And so, hopefully, this will help change the direction of that debate. But you can see why I wanted to preview today, because it would have been a lot to chew on to not get to this till October. So why don't we go ahead and break for lunch? Lee will be available if there are other questions, and we'll have this discussion.
Do we need any of this stuff for this?
Melinda, where are the small group meetings going to be back in here? So if you want to take your notes with you, we'll break out into our small groups where we did last time in the Tejas room, which I guess is where the lunch is waiting for us. So the first question was, do we recommend adding either or both the FSG recommended workforce measurements? The first, employer ratings. The second, measure of alignment. Employer ratings, we said yes. We thought that was worthwhile because it would create employer buy-in. So at least half the value, if not more, is from just engaging employers in the process of reviewing higher education outcomes. There was reference to the survey. We thought that some of the detail was presented today might be getting too in-depth, both too much granularity for employers to respond. And a survey was referenced, the Greenway survey, that would be at a higher level but of value. Secondly, in terms of the measurement of alignment, we said yes to this. In fact, we felt this metric was more primary than the other, not that we wouldn't do the employer ratings, if it was measured as an employability standard based on the annual number and or percentage of newly employed and the amount of wages, total and average. Let me go back to the first thing as well. This is not exactly a point of employer ratings, but to capture what we talked about with Dr. Carnevale and with the Texas workforce, I said that we need to set goals for the number of attainments by need type, in other words, bachelor, associate, the different levels, as well as the percentage of the population holding post-secondary attainment. Question number 2, recommend workforce success measure. If yes, why? And we said, to jump to the end, we said yes, you need, any good scoreboard needs both lead and lag measures. In other words, drivers and results. So on the input employment metric, lead metric is defined as being predictable and influenceable. So we were struggling with what to come up with, but we decided that one thing that would be predictable would be to not just measure, but to inform incoming college students of the earnings gap ratio for a bachelor versus high school. And of course, that doesn't have to be just bachelor versus high school. And in fact, the Gentex social networking campaign already provides some of this information to high school students, where it could do even more good. And then another idea that's related to this is Charles strongly suggested we should match student financial aid levels, I put a $sign there, to critical degrees cost. In other words, if we say we need more engineering degrees or more science degrees and they cost more, then let's tailor the financial aid to match that as an increased incentive for students to pursue those programs. The throughput measure, or results measure rather, on employment, we thought that's a yes, but it's the same as what we said on 1B, same metric. And then lastly, feedback on the overview of post-secondary education costs and degree cost measures that will be considered at the October meeting. First, we said the stakeholder input is needed from the institution's provosts, their CFOs, their CIOs. We need to involve them, engage them in that research process, define or identify the barriers that institutions have to reducing costs would be useful. We did have a lot of kind of how-to discussion, but we said that the focus needs to be on productivity, and there needs to be a balanced leveraging of resources and cost. In other words, this isn't all about cutting costs. It's about improving outcomes, which may mean investing a little more. And then a phrase that we use a lot in my company is creativity before capital, but not in lieu of capital. There were some methodology considerations. We thought time and credits to graduation was an important metric, not just as a measurement of how the last class did, but also to measure incoming freshmen's expectation on how much time and credits they plan to take to graduate, to see if we can have a predictive or lead measure that's influenceable by changing the culture of what our freshmen currently expect, which is that, fifth-year ride for some of our kids even more. So that's really it. We did also talk about, so incoming freshman credit expectation and trends, and then student incentives for 4 to 5 year graduation. That's it. Who is the spokesman for group number 2? Well, Elaine, you are standing.
You're standing, Elaine.
Congratulations.
All right then. Me. Okay. All right. So group number 2, that's us right here. Recommend adding either or both of the employee ratings, and of course it's both. We kind of weighed in more heavily on the actual data side. So that wage transcript that was talked about, Dr. Carvajal talked about earlier, definitely we thought that was a little bit more important because we wanted objective measures of effectiveness versus some of this, as we called it, squishy stuff that we get from some of the surveys. Let's see. We believe that the context that the employer ratings would provide, though, was important. So we definitely need both. But if we can weigh in on the actual peer data, that would be super. Recommend workforce success measures. If so, why? Definitely, we need this. Our challenge, though, was the changing marketplace and how frequently changes occur. And how do we make sure that we are, as all of our institutions and as a state, are staying very nimble to respond to those changes. So we want to make sure that as we're doing the alignment between degrees and degree programs and awards, that we're also keeping top of mind that tomorrow it could be something else. And so we just need to stay nimble with those cycles. And then the results matrix, we're very, very focused on results again here, like we were the first time with regard to the data. The data about wages is really the gold standard, as we talked about. And we just have to recognize, and again, allow for adaptability. Because somebody could be making, as Chairman Heldenfels pointed out, that our truck drivers down south are making $100K. Well, how long will that last? It may last a while, may not. So anyway, let's be very cognizant of what's going on. And both driver and results metrics, both need to be more results, but we definitely need both. That's what we said on that one. Okay, number 3, feedback on overview of post-secondary educational costs. One of the things that we talked about was the way the model, Lee presented his model today, was based on the current 2004 cohort, the actual costs, and then it was drilled down from there if a certain number of actions were taken. One of our questions was, how do we know that top line cost, $67K, is really what it should be? In other words, is there a way to model a utopia environment that kind of takes into account the general cost and then build it up? And so we create what Lee talked about as a lower boundary. Because we could folks could argue that 67K is already inflated because of the rising costs in higher ed. So just because we whittle that down with a few policy changes, is that still good enough? What should it cost? So we talked a little bit more about also the fact that an institution is composed of several colleges. Different colleges actually have different costs associated with them. And should we not break it down by college or department or degree program? Engineering costs more than English, if you will. And so we need to make sure that as we globalize the data on a top line, i.e. that 67K, that we don't lose the fact that each of the colleges will actually have a different cost. So if we make decisions based on the top line, are we going to have unintended consequences for different colleges or programs that actually have to incur more costs? So one of the challenges that Lee has already worked on, and he showed us an example in business, is being able to take, okay, what should a business degree cost? And so we're just encouraging that level of understanding of the data so that as we make decisions on the top line, we understand what that top line is composed of, and that each institution is going to vary because of the different programs that they have within that institution. There we go.
Group number 3's
That's
presenter.
not my stand-up again.
Hey, Elaine, I just had one question. Would you grab my reading glasses there?
And Mr.
I shall.
And Mr. Chairman, I'd like to compliment Elaine on a wonderful presentation.
Yeah, my goodness. That's right, Mr. Chairman. That makes 3 Aggies presenting here. So,
yeah, didn't even think about that.
Anyway, we didn't write down as much here. We had so much intellect in our group that we couldn't take time to write. We had to discuss everything to a great detail. I thought one of the best things I learned out of the session came from Pam, and it wasn't even on this. We were talking about graduation rates, and she said her daughter, when she went in for freshman orientation at a small school somewhere, that day they gave her a cap and gown and said, "You'll put this on 4 years from now." Very effective, I bet. So I'm going to have to tell that story around the country now. We, pretty much what you've already heard is kind of where we wound up. And I think Phil said something in our discussion that was very good. The more data we can get, more good data that we can get, the better. And that we ought to collect it and let the pros look at it and be careful with it. Don't use it too carefully or too quickly. Make sure we know what it says and know what it means. And there's evidently a lot of good data out there now that didn't used to be. I thought Dr. Carnavelli talking about the tying the transcripts to the wages through the government system. He said Texas had done very well. So I thought it was a good comment by Phil too. I didn't make any good ones. She had a good one. Phil had a good one. And but let's get all the data we can. So that's reflected in what we said here in both cases. We think metrics are important, and to develop metrics, you got to know what you're talking about, and you got to have data to do it. So, we favored both of these. We thought the tuning project was really good. That it appears to be collecting the kind of information that needs to be done, and you've got people playing into it, like the 17 engineering schools that have done it, and you've got employers. Now, the problem is, are we getting the right employers, and can we make sure we've got a broad cross-section of them, because that's going to be important, not just a narrow bunch. And I know a lot of employers, when they get these kind of surveys, they say, I'm too busy. I don't have time to provide it. So somehow it'd be good to see if we could get some quality check on who are we hearing from, and are we getting a good spread. Let me call it that way. So we think we need both of those from the top. We also think on the workforce success measure, we think those are important too. We know it's not easy, but we got a lot of data. We came back to the kind of the input side, the tuning project being very important to that. And on the output side, we have a question that it seems like in both of these, is there some way to measure satisfaction? And that's an objective question. Satisfaction of the employer and the employee. And we don't know how to do that. We just said, is there a way? Because I think Ray made a good point this morning when, the employer wants, a 30-year experienced guy the first day at about $50K, and it's not going to happen. So anyhow, is there a way to say, are you really satisfied, though, with what you're seeing? After you answer all these very detailed questions. What's your overall level of satisfaction with this employee? And then let's ask the employee, did he get or she get out of it what she expected? And that's a fine-tuned point that might have to come later, but it's a question. So we're also for strong yes on both of those. And then finally, on the cost savings and cost, how you cut it, measure them carefully. There is a point here that we've actually got three players in here. We got the feds, we got the state, and we got the student. And so we got to make sure, I think, as we go through this, that we understand the implications of all three. The impact to the student is one thing. The impact to the state is yet another. The institutions, Phil pointed this out, they're not, and we got it on here, they're not too incentivized today to cut out the non-completers, because with the formula funding and the fact that they're living in residence halls and paying their fees and all that, it's not all bad, whether they finish or not. And now we know they also have this push to get them finished and get them out in 4 years if possible. But if you think of it financially from that standpoint, they don't have a great incentive to kind of push the non-completers out of the way. The other thing is that there are a lot of fixed costs involved in those student costs, as well as the states and the feds. So none of us should walk away. I think that number was $650 million or something like that in non-completers.
Yeah, 648. Yeah.
And you're not going to save all of that by getting rid of them quicker or doing something to that. Some of those costs are going to still be there. So you might save some portion of it, maybe 30% of it. And in all of this on cost, and other groups obviously did more thinking about that, and you can notice the handwriting is different here. That's mine. I keep coming back to protect the quality as we think out whatever method we use to get at the right number, which is probably a good place to start, and then how much can you cut it. Make sure we don't get into that too bad. And I'm not talking about just the Tier 1 universities.
Right.
I'm talking about all the universities.
Right. No, I'm glad you
protect what
that.
they are and protect their good points, and let's just do it carefully.
Thanks, Jerry. It also strikes me, really, all three groups, it strikes me that as we move with our research toward the next meeting, which will be about efficiency and productivity, that if every one of those three legs, the state, the federal government, and the student and their parents, try to capture those savings, the savings will have to be shared among those three. We can't say, okay, we think it's possible to cut the cost by $11,000 or $12,000, and then the state says, okay, I want all $11,000, $12,000. The students and the parents are going to say, I want it all. So some thought needs to be given to, once we identify what a good, as Elaine put it, what's an aspirational target over what in today's dollars a degree should cost. And then we've got to talk about the appropriate sources of the revenue and who shares and how they share in those so-called savings. So that's something to give thought to as well. All right. Well, we have a meeting coming up next on October 24th with the next day a board meeting that will be looking at these measurements. So I'm going to ask our staff to kind of begin preparing the results, if you will, the consensus of our first the last three meetings, including today, that have focused on measures, so that we can get that out to you early, get your feedback on does this look right in terms of primary goals, supporting objectives. We're not going to try to get down into the minutia, but we are going to ask for your feedback on helping define those next big targets for Texas in 2030, and because we hope to turn around and present it to the coordinating board the very next day. We're going to try to get that in front, 3/4 of it in front of you now, and then add that last piece that we meet about on the 24th. Does that make sense? Is everybody comfortable with that kind of approach? We may even try to schedule a conference call or two somewhere in there to have some discussion if we can work that out. Anything left for the good of the order before we adjourn?
Good meeting.
Well,
Best meeting we've had.
Well, good. I'm glad you enjoyed it. There was a lot of new information, I think, that some of us hadn't covered before. So thank you again for your participation and your time. And we'll adjourn.